It began in the frozen forests and endless snowfields of northern Europe, where two nations faced each other in one of the most brutal and unforgiving conflicts of the 20th century. The Winter War of 1939-1940 was fought not only between Finland and the Soviet Union, but between human endurance and the merciless cold of nature itself. When Stalin's Red Army invaded, expecting a quick and easy victory, they instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare of snow, ice, and Finnish resistance that would become legendary. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a superpower with tanks, aircraft, and endless manpower, the Finns had only their determination, their knowledge of the terrain, and their will to survive. Soldiers dressed in white camouflage melted into the forests, striking suddenly and disappearing into the frozen silence, inventing tactics that would stun the world and humble one of the largest armies on Earth. Battles were fought in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees, where weapons froze, machines stalled, and men sometimes froze to death before ever seeing the enemy. It was a war of ambushes, skis, Molotov cocktails, and desperate courage, a struggle that showed how determination and ingenuity could hold back overwhelming force. Yet behind the bravery and defiance was also immense suffering. Villages burned, civilians uprooted, and soldiers on both sides enduring frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. The Winter War was short in duration, but immense in consequence, shaping the path of Finland's survival and the Soviet Union's reputation on the eve of World War II. In this documentary, we will uncover the entire history of the Winter War, from the political tensions that sparked it, to the desperate battles in the snow, to the uneasy peace that followed, and the lessons it left behind for both nations and the wider world. So before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you listening from? And what time of day is it right now as you join me on this journey into the frozen battlefields of the Winter War? In the winter of 1917, as the Russian Empire crumbled under the weight of revolution and war, Finland stood at a crossroads of history. For centuries, it had been a grand duchy under Russian rule, a northern frontier where icy forests and rugged lakes formed both a natural barrier and a cultural divide. The February Revolution in Petrograd shook the old order, and Finnish leaders seized the moment to demand autonomy. By December, amid the chaos of Lenin's Bolshevik seizure of power, the Finnish parliament declared full independence. Recognition came swiftly, for the new Soviet government was too weak to contest the loss, its armies fractured and its empire collapsing. Yet behind that recognition lay resentment, a bitter sense in Moscow that Finland had slipped from its grasp during a moment of weakness. In Helsinki, joy was tempered by fear, for the fledgling nation was surrounded by larger powers with uncertain intentions. Independence was both triumph and peril, and from the beginning, mistrust settled like frost between Finland and its former master. The birth of Finland as a state did not bring unity, but instead unleashed internal divisions that mirrored the wider turmoil of Europe. The Finnish Civil War of 1918 pitted the conservative whites, supported by German arms and officers, against the socialist Reds, who drew strength from workers and peasants and received backing from Bolshevik Russia. It was a brutal conflict fought with executions, reprisals, and ideological fury, leaving scars that would last for generations. German-trained General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim emerged as the leader of the White forces, guiding them to victory in a campaign of disciplined strategy and ruthless determination. The defeat of the Reds cemented Finland's alignment with the West, even as resentment simmered among the working class. For Moscow, the war confirmed Finland's hostility, a neighbor willing to crush socialism with foreign support. For Helsinki, The intervention of Russian Bolsheviks in the war deepened distrust and fear of invasion. The legacy of 1918 was division at home and suspicion abroad, and the shadow of that civil war lingered as the interwar years unfolded. In the aftermath, Finland sought to secure its fragile independence, but geography and history gave little comfort. To the west lay Sweden, a cultural cousin but hesitant ally, cautious not to antagonize Moscow. To the east stretched the vast Soviet Union, still consolidating power, but unwilling to forget the humiliation of losing Finland. Along the 300-kilometer border, forests, lakes and marshes formed a natural frontier, but one difficult to defend against a massive army. In Leningrad, barely 30 kilometers from the Finnish frontier, Soviet leaders saw vulnerability, the great industrial city, exposed to foreign artillery, if Finland ever aligned with their enemies. In Helsinki, politicians debated neutrality, democracy, and defense, knowing that survival depended on careful balance. The interwar years were filled with both optimism and anxiety, as the young nation built schools, infrastructure, and a parliamentary system. Yet beneath the progress, a sense of unease remained. Finland had its independence, but it was independence perched on a knife's edge, and every move was shadowed by the memory of 1917. The mistrust between Finland and Moscow was reinforced by conflicting visions of the future. The Soviets, under Lenin and later Stalin, viewed Finland not as a permanently lost state, but as a temporary deviation from history. Communist cells within Finland received support from Moscow, fueling strikes and agitation that kept alive fears of revolution. Finnish leaders responded with vigilance, outlawing radical parties and strengthening security services. The spectre of Bolshevik subversion haunted Finland's fragile democracy, sharpening the line between left and right. Meanwhile, the Soviets built their Red Army into a massive force, its eyes fixed not only on Europe, but also on the vulnerable northwest frontier. The Karelian Isthmus, a strip of land separating Leningrad from Finland, became a zone of constant tension. Finnish patrols watched Soviet border guards, each side suspicious of the other's intent. The ideological divide was not abstract. It was written into daily encounters at the frontier, and every passing year seemed to deepen the fault line carved by revolution. Yet Finland was not merely a pawn in the games of great powers. It was a nation forging its own path. The 1920 Treaty of Tartu with Soviet Russia established borders, granting Finland recognition, but leaving both sides dissatisfied. Finland gained access to the ice-free port of Petsamo in the Arctic, while Moscow retained Karelia, a land with deep cultural ties to the Finns. The treaty provided peace, but not trust. In Helsinki, it was seen as a fragile guarantee, a temporary reprieve, rather than a permanent settlement. In Moscow, it was viewed as a humiliating concession, made during weakness, to be corrected when the balance of power shifted. For ordinary Finns, the treaty meant stability, allowing farmers, fishermen, and workers to rebuild their lives after war. But soldiers continued to drill in forests, and fortifications began to rise along the eastern frontier. The paper peace masked a deeper truth. Neither side believed the other would honor it forever, and both prepared quietly for the day it might collapse. The interwar years also saw the rise of personalities who would later shape the Winter War. In Finland, Mannerheim became a national figure, both admired and controversial, embodying military discipline and aristocratic leadership. He warned repeatedly that Finland must be ready to defend itself against Soviet aggression, even when others hoped diplomacy could prevent war. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin consolidated power with purges and terror, reshaping the Red Army by eliminating much of its officer corps. The contrast was striking, a small nation led by a pragmatic soldier versus a vast empire ruled by a paranoid dictator. These figures loomed over the evolving relationship between the two states, their decisions guided by history as much as by current events. For Finns, Mannerheim symbolized endurance, the memory of victory in 1918. For Soviets, Stalin symbolized strength, determined to reclaim what had been lost. The seeds of the Winter War lay not only in geography, but in the ambitions of these men, and their shadow grew with every passing year. Economic and strategic considerations further deepened tensions as Europe edged toward another great conflict. Finland's forests and mines became valuable resources, supplying timber, nickel, and other materials coveted by great powers. The Arctic port of Petsamo offered a rare outlet to the north, free of ice and strategically significant for trade. Soviet planners feared that in a future war, foreign powers might use Finnish territory to threaten Leningrad or to sever Soviet access to resources. Meanwhile, Finland relied on trade with Britain, Germany, and Sweden, tying its survival to Western markets. This economic orientation alarmed Moscow, which saw in every contract a political alignment against Soviet interests. Neutrality became Finland's shield, but one constantly tested by shifting alliances. The stage was being set, not only for a clash of armies, but for a collision of strategic necessities. And when those necessities collided, it was Finland that stood in the middle. By the late 1930s, Europe was again sliding toward catastrophe, and Finland's precarious position grew more dangerous with each passing month. The rise of Nazi Germany and the looming storm of global war magnified the importance of every borderland. In Moscow, Stalin watched with growing anxiety as Germany expanded, fearing a future invasion through Eastern Europe. Finland, with its long frontier and proximity to Leningrad, was seen less as a neighbor and more as a potential battlefield. In Helsinki, leaders feared being crushed between two giants, uncertain whether the threat would come first from Berlin or from Moscow. Preparations for defense intensified, with the construction of the Mannerheim line across the Karelian Isthmus. Yet few believed it could withstand the full might of the Red Army. The shadow of 1917 had not faded, it had grown darker, longer and more ominous, and soon it would erupt into fire and snow. The Winter War did not begin in 1939 by accident. It was the culmination of decades of mistrust and unfinished struggles. From the moment Finland declared independence, its existence was a challenge to Soviet ambitions and an inspiration to those seeking freedom from Moscow. For the Finns, survival meant constant vigilance, a readiness to fight again if necessary. For the Soviets, survival meant reclaiming what they believed had been unjustly torn away in the chaos of revolution. The shadow of 1917 stretched across every decision, every negotiation, every rifle fired in the forests of Karelia. It was not simply a war of territory, but a war of memory, ideology, and survival. And as Europe plunged into the abyss of World War II, the small nation of Finland would soon find itself locked in battle with a giant. A battle born in revolution, matured in mistrust, and destined to echo through history as the Winter War. In the 1920s, Finland was a nation still learning how to govern itself, its fragile democracy tested by the legacy of civil war. The wounds of 1918 were raw, with political lines dividing victors from vanquished, conservatives from socialists, whites from reds. The parliamentary system struggled to represent a society split between urban workers demanding reform and rural farmers clinging to tradition. Assassinations, strikes, and attempted uprisings haunted the early republic, threatening to tear it apart before it could stand on its own. Yet, against the odds, Finland endured, stabilizing its government through compromise and persistence. Universal suffrage gave women an equal voice, making Finland one of the first democracies in Europe to grant such rights. Coalitions shifted, cabinets fell, but the system held, its very survival a quiet triumph. Still beneath the democratic veneer lurked the memory of fratricidal war. That memory cast suspicion on the left and fostered fears of Soviet influence. And it was in that tension that Finland's interwar politics took root. Nationalist politics emerged as a force during the interwar years, reflecting both pride and paranoia. Conservative factions emphasized loyalty to the white legacy, elevating the army and General Mannerheim as symbols of stability. Social Democrats sought to prove their loyalty to democracy, distancing themselves from the Reds while advocating reforms for workers and the poor. Far-right groups, inspired by the rising fascist movements in Italy and Germany, began to organize, promoting militarism and ethnic nationalism. The Lapua movement, born in 1929, marched across the countryside with violent rhetoric and assaults on leftist organizations. Their influence reached the heart of politics, culminating in the failed Mentsele Rebellion of 1932, an attempted coup against democracy itself. Mannerheim refused to support them, helping preserve constitutional order. The episode underscored Finland's vulnerability to extremism, yet also its resilience in defending democratic institutions. Still, the specter of radicalism remained, a constant reminder that Finnish politics mirrored the turbulence of Europe, and every shift in ideology was watched carefully from Moscow. The foreign policy of Finland in these years was a delicate dance, a balancing act, performed on a geopolitical tightrope. Surrounded by larger powers, the country sought to avoid entanglement while preserving independence. Sweden was a natural cultural ally, but Stockholm pursued strict neutrality and offered little in the way of binding guarantees. Germany, disarmed and humiliated after the Treaty of Versailles, appeared weak in the 1920s, but grew increasingly influential as the Nazi regime took power in the 1930s. Britain and France, distant but powerful, offered vague sympathy without committing themselves to Finland's defense. And looming always to the east was the Soviet Union, unpredictable and menacing, its armies growing stronger each year. Diplomats in Helsinki struggled to chart a course that would keep Finland safe without provoking any great power. Neutrality became official policy, but it was neutrality under siege. Finland was caught between East and West, and every decision carried the weight of survival. The defense of the nation became a pressing question. For Finland's leaders, new geography gave them little margin for error. The Karelian Isthmus, a narrow stretch of land leading directly to Leningrad, was a glaring vulnerability. Fortifications were begun in the 1920s and 1930s, forming what would become known as the Mannerheim Line, though resources were scarce and construction uneven. The army itself was small, dependent on conscription, and ill-equipped compared to the mechanized giants rising in Europe. Weapons were a patchwork of foreign imports and aging stockpiles, from German Mauser rifles to French artillery. Training focused on small unit tactics, using Finland's forests and lakes as natural defenses against invasion. Officers emphasized mobility, improvisation, and the use of skis to outmaneuver a larger foe. The strategy was defensive in nature. Finland could not conquer, but it could bleed an enemy in the snow. Yet all knew that if the Red Army came, even the Mannerheim Line would not be enough. Preparation was necessary, but hope was the only shield. Life for ordinary Finns during the interwar period was a mixture of hardship, recovery, and national pride. The economy relied on forestry and agriculture, with timber exports providing the backbone of trade. Farmers toiled in small villages, their lives shaped by harsh winters and brief summers of backbreaking labor. Industrialization advanced slowly, with urban centers like Helsinki and Tampere growing, but still modest compared to Europe's great cities. Education was prioritized, and literacy soared, creating a sense of national identity rooted in culture and language. The Kalevala, Finland's national epic, was celebrated in schools, reinforcing pride in heritage and history. Sport also played a role, with athletes like Paavo Nurmi, the Flying Finn, becoming global icons of endurance and discipline. These achievements gave the young nation confidence on the world stage. Yet beneath the progress lurked anxiety, for every family knew their sons might one day be called to defend the homeland, and that possibility was never far from their thoughts. The 1930s brought new storms to Europe, and Finland's isolation grew more precarious. The rise of Hitler's Germany alarmed many, yet some Finns saw in Berlin a potential counterbalance to Soviet pressure. The League of Nations offered a forum for diplomacy, and Finland joined in hopes of securing a place within collective security. Yet the League proved weak, unable to prevent Japanese aggression in Asia or Italian conquest in Ethiopia. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, Finnish volunteers went to fight, some for Franco, others for the Republic, reflecting the ideological divisions at home. In Helsinki, leaders watched nervously as the world slid toward conflict, aware that Finland's voice was small in global affairs. Their goal remained survival, to avoid war if possible, and to resist if necessary. But every passing year made neutrality more fragile. And with the growing power of the Soviet Union, Finland's fate seemed increasingly tied to forces beyond its control. Personalities shaped policy as much as institutions, and none loomed larger than Mannerheim. Though retired from official command in the 1920s, he remained a revered figure. His counsel sought in matters of defense and diplomacy. His aristocratic bearing and reputation as Finland's savior in 1918 gave him unmatched authority. Presidents and prime ministers came and went, but Mannerheim's shadow lingered over all decisions related to security. In times of crisis, his voice carried the weight of inevitability, for he embodied the nation's martial spirit. Yet he was cautious, advocating diplomacy, even while urging preparedness. His pragmatism set him apart from radicals on both left and right, making him a stabilizing force in an unstable era. When the storm of war finally came, it was Mannerheim who would lead Finland once again. His presence reassured the people, for they trusted that he would defend the homeland at any cost, and his name became synonymous with survival. As the 1930s drew to a close, the storm clouds over Europe thickened into darkness. Germany reigned, the Soviet Union expanded into the Baltics, and the Western democracies hesitated, paralyzed by indecision. Finland found itself ever more exposed, its neutrality fragile against the ambitions of empires. In the forests of Karelia, soldiers trained with rifles and skis, knowing they might soon be called to fight. In the parliament, debates raged over how to preserve independence without provoking Moscow. Farmers harvested timber, engineers strengthened bunkers, and families whispered prayers against war. Every action carried the weight of uncertainty, for Finland was balanced precariously between East and West. The nation's survival depended on choices made in capitals far beyond its borders. And as the storm broke in September 1939, with the invasion of Poland, Finland realized the hour of decision had arrived. In the corridors of the Kremlin during the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin studied maps of the northwest frontier with an intensity bordering on obsession. The city of Leningrad, the jewel of the Soviet Union's north, lay a mere 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. To Stalin, this distance was intolerable, a dagger pointed at the heart of Soviet power in the region. The lessons of history weighed heavily. Invasions from Sweden, Poland, and even Napoleon had once threatened Russia's survival. In his mind, the buffer zone between the Soviet Union and potential enemies had to be widened, secured, and dominated. He saw Finland not as a small neutral state, but as a possible springboard for Western aggression. The trauma of the First World War and the Russian Civil War had taught him that weakness invited disaster. Now, as Europe slid once more into conflict, he believed that only ruthless preparation could protect the Soviet homeland. For Stalin, security and expansion were inseparable concepts. The Soviet leaders' concerns were amplified by the rise of Nazi Germany and the unfolding of Hitler's ambitions in Eastern Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 had carved the continent into spheres of influence, giving Stalin a free hand in the Baltic. In rapid succession, the Red Army moved into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, securing bases and forcing governments to accept Soviet control. Each annexation brought Leningrad a wider shield, a protective ring of occupied territory stretching westward. Yet Finland remained outside this chain, stubbornly independent and unwilling to bend to Moscow's pressure. Stalin viewed this defiance as both dangerous and insulting, for it exposed the vulnerability of the northern flank. A hostile Finland could invite German armies to encircle Leningrad in a future war. Even a neutral Finland in Stalin's eyes could not be trusted when German influence loomed so large in Europe, and so his gaze settled firmly on Helsinki, where diplomacy would soon give way to force. Geography dictated Stalin's calculations as much as ideology. The Karelian Isthmus offered a narrow land bridge directly to Leningrad, and whoever controlled it controlled the safety of the city. Finnish artillery, if placed at the border, could shell Soviet factories and railways within minutes. The Gulf of Finland, frozen in winter but vital in summer, offered access to the Baltic Sea and potential naval approaches to the Soviet coast. To Stalin, this was not abstract theory, but a matter of life and death for his empire. The Soviet military planners prepared reports warning of the consequences if Finland aligned with Germany. They stressed that in the event of a wider war, German bombers could be stationed on Finnish airfields and strike Leningrad within minutes. Every detail sharpened Stalin's conviction that Finland could not be allowed to remain independent on his doorstep. His solution, shaped by paranoia and pragmatism, was to seize control before Germany could act. In his worldview, preemptive aggression was the purest form of defense. The demand Stalin issued to Finland in the autumn of 1939 reflected this ruthless logic. Soviet negotiators, led by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, summoned Finnish diplomats to Moscow with ultimatums disguised as proposals. They demanded that Finland cede territory on the Karelian Isthmus, lease naval bases on the Gulf of Finland, and transfer strategic islands in the Baltic. In return, the Soviets offered swaths of sparsely populated land in Karelia, a trade they claimed was generous, but which Helsinki saw as a trap. For Finland, giving up territory near Viipuri meant placing the nation's second largest city within easy Soviet reach. The proposals were debated fiercely in the Finnish parliament, where every concession felt like an open invitation to further demands. Stalin watched these discussions with contempt, convinced the Finns would eventually yield under pressure. But he miscalculated the depth of their determination to defend independence. Their refusal hardened his resolve to impose Soviet will by other means. Stalin's distrust of Finland was not only strategic, but also ideological, rooted in his vision of a Soviet buffer empire. In his eyes, the capitalist democracies of Europe were destined to betray one another and ultimately to turn against Moscow. Finland, with its parliamentary system and Western sympathies, symbolized precisely the kind of threat he sought to eliminate. He never forgot that Finland had fought alongside white forces in the Russian Civil War, and its independence had been born out of Russia's weakness in 1917. To him, this was unfinished business, a borderland rebellion that still needed to be crushed. His belief that Finland could harbor enemies of the revolution poisoned every diplomatic interaction. He viewed neutrality as a facade and independence as an affront. And so, even as he sat at the negotiating table, his generals were already drawing invasion plans. In Stalin's worldview, weakness was treason, and compromise was surrender. Neither had any place in his dealings with Finland. The Red Army's position in 1939 seemed overwhelming on paper, adding to Stalin's confidence. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and swarms of aircraft gave the Soviet Union one of the largest military forces in the world. To the Kremlin, Finland appeared as a small, fragile nation that could be overrun in days, perhaps weeks at most. Soviet propaganda described the coming war as a police action, a short campaign to secure borders and liberate Finnish workers. But beneath this bravado lay serious flaws hidden by Stalin's own purges of the military in the late 1930s. Many of the Red Army's most talented commanders had been executed or imprisoned, leaving behind inexperienced replacements. Equipment was abundant, but training was inconsistent, and coordination between units was poor. These weaknesses were invisible to Stalin, who believed sheer numbers could achieve victory. In his mind, Finland was an obstacle, not an equal, and obstacles, he thought, were meant to be crushed under the weight of Soviet might. Within the Kremlin, voices of caution existed but were ignored. Some advisors warned that the Finns were fiercely nationalistic and that their forests and winters were natural allies against invasion. They pointed out that the Finnish army was small but well trained in defensive warfare, skilled in using terrain to its advantage. Others suggested that diplomatic patience might secure concessions without resorting to war. But Stalin, shaped by paranoia and hardened by purges, dismissed these perspectives as cowardice or disloyalty. He believed that hesitation encouraged enemies and that power must always be demonstrated through force. His inner circle, fearful of contradicting him, echoed his confidence and prepared to implement his plans. By the autumn of 1939, the path was set and the machinery of war was already turning. For Stalin, the decision to strike was not rash but inevitable, an extension of his worldview. He saw history as a game of survival, where mercy had no place. As November 1939 approached, the stage was set for confrontation. Soviet artillery units moved into position near the Finnish border, while propaganda campaigns painted Finland as an aggressor. A false flag incident at Manila, where Soviet shells were fired on their own territory and blamed on Finland, provided the pretext for war. The world watched with apprehension as the Red Army prepared to march. Stalin believed he had crafted the perfect plan: overwhelm Finland, secure Leningrad, and demonstrate Soviet power to the West. What he did not anticipate was the resilience of the Finnish people and the ferocity of their defense. The seeds of the Winter War were planted not in the forests of Karelia, but in the calculations of the Kremlin. Stalin's fears, ambitions, and misjudgments converged into a single decision, and that decision would ignite one of the most extraordinary David and Goliath struggles of the Second World War. In the autumn of 1939, as Europe reeled from the shock of Hitler's blitzkrieg in Poland, Soviet diplomats summoned Finnish representatives to Moscow. The meetings were held in the Kremlin's gilded halls, where chandeliers sparkled above tense conversations. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, with his cold, deliberate manner, outlined the Soviet demands with rehearsed precision. The Karelian Isthmus, lying dangerously close to Leningrad, must be ceded to Soviet control. A lease of the Hanko Peninsula, at the southern tip of Finland, was to be granted for a naval base. Several islands in the Gulf of Finland would also have to be surrendered to the Red Banner Fleet. In exchange, the Soviets promised vast tracts of remote, forested Karelia, land of little economic or strategic value. To Molotov, the arrangement was a practical trade, but to the Finns it was a thinly veiled dismantling of their sovereignty. The Finnish delegation was led by Juho Paasikivi, a seasoned diplomat known for his pragmatism, accompanied by Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner. They listened in silence as Molotov presented maps, pointing to the areas demanded and the lands offered in return. Paasikivi understood the stakes. Refusal might invite invasion, but acceptance meant compromising Finland's independence and leaving Viipuri exposed. Tanner, representing the Social Democratic Party, was equally cautious, wary of both Soviet aggression and domestic backlash. The Finnish leaders returned home to consult with President Kyösti Kallio and the parliament, carrying with them the heavy burden of impossible choices. Debates in Helsinki revealed deep divisions. Some argued for concessions to buy time, while others insisted that surrendering land would only embolden Moscow. In the end, unity was forged around resistance. The Finns decided that their independence, won only 2 decades earlier, was not negotiable. Back in Moscow, the Soviets grew impatient with what they perceived as stalling. Stalin, observing from behind the scenes, viewed the Finnish hesitation as insolence. He believed that small states had no right to defy great powers, and their refusal only hardened his resolve. Molotov's tone became sharper in subsequent meetings, his patience evaporating as he repeated the demands. The atmosphere turned increasingly hostile, with Finnish delegates walking a tightrope between diplomacy and defiance. Paasikivi tried to explore compromises, suggesting minor adjustments or mutual guarantees of non-aggression, but these overtures were dismissed. Stalin wanted concrete territorial gains, not symbolic gestures. To him, compromise was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Every refusal confirmed his conviction that Finland must be coerced, if not outright crushed. The public mood in Finland mirrored the tension at the negotiating table. Newspapers published maps of the Soviet demands, stoking fears among citizens who saw their homeland under threat. Farmers in Karelia worried about losing ancestral lands, while city dwellers in Viipuri feared becoming frontline targets. The memory of the Civil War still lingered, shaping distrust of Soviet intentions. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, demanding that their leaders hold firm. Across the country, volunteers began training in civil defense units, preparing for the worst even as talks continued. Churches held services where priests spoke of sacrifice and duty to the nation. Ordinary Finns understood that war might come, but they believed it was better to fight than to surrender without resistance. National unity, forged in defiance, grew stronger with each passing day of failed diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Soviets orchestrated propaganda campaigns designed to frame Finland as unreasonable. Articles in Pravda denounced Finnish leaders as puppets of Britain and France. Radio broadcasts accused Helsinki of endangering peace by refusing generous Soviet offers. The aim was clear: to prepare the Soviet population for a conflict that would soon be labeled defensive rather than aggressive. Behind closed doors, Stalin instructed his generals to finalize invasion plans. Units were moved closer to the border under the guise of exercises, while Soviet airfields in the Leningrad district hummed with preparation. Diplomacy, in Stalin's mind, had already served its purpose. It had revealed Finland's refusal, provided a facade of reason, and given him the justification he needed to act. For the Finnish negotiators, the final meetings in Moscow were bleak. Paasikivi and Tanner understood that the gap between the two sides was unbridgeable. The Soviets spoke in terms of strategic necessity, while the Finns spoke of survival as a nation. Maps and charts could not reconcile these conflicting visions. When the Finnish delegates prepared to leave, Molotov reportedly remarked with chilling calm, "We shall settle matters by other means." It was a thinly veiled threat, one that Paasikivi carried back to Helsinki with grim clarity. The last hope of avoiding conflict through compromise had evaporated. The train carrying the Finnish delegation back across the snowbound countryside seemed less like a diplomatic mission and more like a prelude to war. In Helsinki, the government convened emergency sessions to assess the looming crisis. President Kallio, frail but determined, urged Parliament to prepare for every eventuality. Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the respected elder statesman of Finland's military, quietly began organizing defenses along the Karelian Isthmus. Ammunition stockpiles were checked, conscripts were mobilized, and engineers strengthened the fortifications of the Mannerheim line. Yet everyone knew that Finland's resources were limited. Their army was small, their industry underdeveloped, and their allies uncertain. Still, morale was high, and determination fierce. The refusal to yield territory was more than a political stance. It was a declaration of national character. As November approached, tensions reached breaking point. The Soviets staged the shelling at Manila, blaming Finland for an artillery attack that killed Soviet soldiers. It was a carefully orchestrated lie, but one that provided the Kremlin with the excuse it sought. Demands were issued for Finland to withdraw its troops from the border, demands that Helsinki rejected as baseless. The stage was now set for invasion, with diplomacy exhausted and trust shattered. The world watched nervously. Though few expected what would follow, Finland had defied a superpower, standing alone on principle and pride. Stalin believed he was about to deliver a swift lesson in submission. Instead, he was about to unleash a war that would astonish the world. The collapse of negotiations was not a failure of diplomacy alone, but a clash of worldviews. For Finland, independence was sacred, bought with blood in 1917 and defended against Bolshevik forces in 1918. For Stalin, survival of the Soviet state demanded the subjugation of its neighbors and the expansion of its borders. There could be no common ground between these two visions, and so in the bitter cold of late November 1939, the sound of failed negotiations gave way to the thunder of artillery. What began in the gilded halls of Moscow would end in the frozen forests of Karelia. Diplomacy had failed, but Finland's resolve was only just beginning to reveal itself. The road to war for Finland was paved not only in Moscow but also in Berlin, where the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had redrawn the map of Eastern Europe. Signed in August 1939, the agreement shocked the world by uniting two ideological enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in a cynical marriage of convenience. Hidden within its secret protocol were clauses dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with the Baltic states and Finland falling squarely into Stalin's domain. To Adolf Hitler, the pact secured his western flank for the invasion of Poland. To Stalin, it opened the door for expansion into territories he considered essential to Soviet security. The ink on the treaty was barely dry when Red Army troops occupied eastern Poland, and Soviet demands soon fell upon Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Finland, watching these moves with mounting alarm, realized it was only a matter of time before the Kremlin turned its attention north. In the autumn of 1939, while Soviet negotiators browbeat the Finns in Moscow, Stalin was already testing the limits of Western resolve. Britain and France, locked in the so-called phony war with Germany, had little appetite to confront the Soviet Union directly. Their governments issued protests when Stalin annexed the Baltic states, but their words carried no weight and no troops followed. Even the League of Nations, founded to prevent such acts of aggression, proved toothless. For Finland, the message was clear. It stood alone. Sweden, its cultural cousin, declared neutrality, unwilling to provoke Moscow or Berlin. Norway, still recovering from political instability, offered sympathy but no military aid. The isolation of Finland was stark and suffocating, a nation of barely 4 million people facing a giant of 170 million. Yet in Helsinki, resolve stiffened rather than faltered. If the West would not defend them, the Finns would defend themselves. Soviet confidence in victory was as vast as the empire itself. The Red Army, though scarred by Stalin's purges, boasted enormous reserves of manpower, tanks and artillery. Military planners estimated that Finland could be conquered in a matter of weeks, perhaps even days. Propaganda organs described the campaign as a liberation, insisting that Finnish workers longed for Soviet protection. Stalin even prepared a puppet government in advance, led by Finnish communist Otto Kuusinen, to be installed once Helsinki fell. The assumption was that the Finnish people, presented with overwhelming Soviet force, would collapse into obedience. Few in the Kremlin understood the depth of Finnish nationalism or the fierce determination to resist. Numbers and ideology blinded them to the reality of a small nation prepared to fight for every tree, every village, and every frozen lake. As the storm gathered, Finland braced itself for impact. Mobilization orders went out, and men left farms and factories to don grey uniforms. The Finnish army was small, barely 250,000 mobilized troops, compared to the millions of the Red Army, but it was cohesive, well-trained, and intimately familiar with its homeland. Volunteers from civil guard organizations, known as the Kunta, reinforced the ranks, bringing rifles that had seen use in the Civil War 2 decades earlier. In the towns and villages of Karelia, families bid farewell to fathers and sons, knowing they might not return. Women's organizations, such as the Lotta Svärd, rallied to support the war effort, providing food, medical aid, and logistics. The atmosphere in Finland was grim but resolute. Unlike in Moscow, no one spoke of quick victories or easy wars. The Finns prepared themselves for hardship, not glory, and their realism would soon prove vital. In the Kremlin, Stalin finalized his plans with characteristic secrecy and calculation. The false flag shelling at Manila in late November 1939 was orchestrated to provide the legal excuse for invasion. Soviet artillery fired upon their own soil, killing a handful of soldiers, and immediately accused Finland of aggression. Demands for troop withdrawals were issued, knowing full well that Helsinki would refuse. This was the final diplomatic charade before the guns roared. Stalin presented himself as a man forced into war by Finnish obstinacy, a defender of Soviet security against foreign plots. The truth was far simpler. The conquest of Finland had already been decided. Molotov's speeches and Pravda's headlines were merely the curtain dressing for a military campaign, months in the making. The decision for war had passed from the negotiation tables to the battlefield. Across Finland, the population sensed what was coming, and preparations turned from fear into action. Civilians dug trenches, camouflaged bunkers, and built barricades across roads leading from the Soviet border. Ski patrols drilled in the forests, testing their mobility in the deepening snow. Ammunition was stockpiled, though supplies were desperately short, and antiquated weapons were pressed back into service. Churches rang their bells, not in celebration, but as calls for prayer and perseverance. The government broadcast appeals for calm, urging citizens to trust in their armed forces and in the righteousness of their cause. Behind these public reassurances, officials grappled with the grim mathematics of war. They knew Finland's survival depended not on matching Soviet strength, but on exploiting Soviet weaknesses. Terrain, weather, and morale would be their weapons. Western observers, too, began to take note, though often with a detached curiosity rather than urgency. Journalists filed reports describing Finland's isolation and the imbalance of forces. Military experts predicted swift Soviet victory, citing the crushing weight of tanks and artillery massed along the border. Yet some voices, especially in Scandinavia, warned that the Finns were not to be underestimated. Swedish volunteers began to organize clandestinely, preparing to cross the border and fight for their neighbors. In London and Paris, debates raged about whether to intervene, not out of love for Finland, but out of fear that Soviet expansion might upset the balance of power in the north. Still, no decisions were made, and no armies marched. Finland remained a pawn in great power politics, sacrificed to buy time for others. By late November 1939, the tension was unbearable, as if the forests themselves held their breath. Snow had fallen thick across Karelia, blanketing the land in silence. Soviet divisions massed along the border, their breath steaming in the cold, as they waited for orders. Finnish outposts reported unusual movements, columns of tanks rumbling into staging areas, artillery pieces unlimbered and aimed west. On November 30th, the silence was shattered. Soviet bombers appeared in the skies above Helsinki, dropping their loads on the capital and killing civilians in the streets. Artillery thundered along the frontier, and Soviet troops poured across the border. The Winter War had begun, not with a declaration of hostilities, but with fire and blood. Diplomacy had ended. The world now turned its gaze north, to a frozen battlefield where David would face Goliath. At dawn on November 30th, 1939, the people of Helsinki awoke to the distant drone of engines overhead. It was a sound unfamiliar to most, and for a moment many mistook it for civilian aircraft. But as the dark silhouettes of Soviet bombers grew larger against the pale winter sky, reality set in with terrifying clarity. The first explosions shook the capital as bombs fell indiscriminately upon streets, homes, and tramlines. Fires erupted in the city center, sending plumes of black smoke into the frozen air. Dozens of civilians were killed in the first strikes, among them women and children. Shock gave way to fury as news spread across the country. The Soviet Union had launched a full-scale invasion. In a single morning, Finland's fragile peace had been shattered, and the Winter War had begun. Along the border, the Red Army surged forward in massive numbers, their advance stretching across the entire 300-kilometer frontier. Columns of tanks ground through the snow, supported by artillery batteries that rained shells on Finnish outposts. Soviet troops, bundled in inadequate winter uniforms, moved in dense formations as if expecting minimal resistance. Their commanders, overconfident, assumed the Finnish defenses would collapse within days. The Red Army's orders were clear: advance swiftly, capture the Karelian Isthmus, and march toward Helsinki. In Moscow, Stalin believed his invasion would be a lightning campaign, a swift victory to rival Hitler's conquest of Poland. Yet on the snowy ridges and frozen lakes of Karelia, the Finnish army was waiting, silent and determined. The opening blows of the Soviet invasion had been loud and brutal, but the real battle was only beginning. In Helsinki, the government acted with extraordinary speed and unity. President Kyösti Kallio and Prime Minister Risto Risti declared a state of national defense, calling upon every citizen to contribute to the survival of the nation. Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the revered military leader of Finland, was appointed commander-in-chief of all forces. His presence alone inspired confidence, for Mannerheim was a man who embodied both experience and dignity. Having fought as an officer in the Tsar's army before 1917, he understood the strengths and weaknesses of the Russian military better than most. Addressing the nation by radio, Mannerheim urged calm, courage, and resolve, assuring Finns that their fight was just and their cause sacred. His words carried weight, reaching not only soldiers at the front, but also families huddled in villages and towns across the countryside. For Finland, survival now depended on unity as much as on arms. The Finnish army mobilized swiftly, though its resources were limited. Approximately 250,000 men were called to the colors, many of them reservists with hunting rifles slung across their shoulders. Against them stood over 450,000 Soviet troops, supported by 2,000 tanks and nearly 1,000 aircraft. The imbalance was staggering, but Finnish troops had advantages of their own. They knew the terrain intimately, from the frozen lakes that could bear skis to the dense forests that provided cover for ambushes. Their uniforms, tailored for the cold, included white snow camouflage that blended seamlessly into the landscape. By contrast, Soviet soldiers struggled in heavy brown overcoats that turned stiff in sub-zero temperatures. Weapons were scarce, but Finnish ingenuity was not. Molotov cocktails, simple bottles filled with gasoline and tar, were readied as improvised anti-tank weapons, named mockingly after the Soviet foreign minister. In every way, Finland was preparing to turn its weaknesses into strengths. Civilian life transformed overnight into wartime endurance. In Helsinki, volunteers rushed to aid the wounded, clearing rubble from the streets as air raid sirens wailed. In rural towns, families opened their homes to evacuees fleeing the border regions under Soviet shellfire. Women organized through the Lotusfjärd, providing food, clothing, and medical assistance to soldiers on the front. Children carried sandbags to reinforce shelters, while priests delivered sermons urging faith in God and country. The shock of the first bombing raids hardened into determination as ordinary citizens vowed to resist to the last breath. Even school teachers reminded their students that they were not only pupils but also defenders of Finland's future. The entire society became part of the war effort, each act of solidarity reinforcing the nation's resolve. Stalin had expected a frightened population to yield quickly, but instead he had awakened a nation of fighters. At the front, the Red Army's first encounters with Finnish resistance were sobering. On the Karelian Isthmus, Soviet tanks advanced in dense columns, only to find roads blocked by felled trees and hidden minefields. Finnish ski troops darted in and out of the forests, cutting supply lines and ambushing patrols with deadly precision. Artillery units, concealed in camouflaged bunkers, opened fire at close range, devastating Soviet formations that advanced too rigidly. The Soviets, poorly coordinated and overconfident, suffered unexpected casualties in the opening days. Their soldiers, many conscripts from distant regions of the Soviet Union, were bewildered by the harsh climate and unforgiving terrain. Discipline faltered as hunger and cold set in. What had been envisioned as a rapid march to Helsinki was already bogging down into a brutal struggle. The myth of an easy conquest was beginning to unravel. International reaction to the invasion was swift, though not decisive. Western newspapers condemned the Soviet assault, portraying Finland as a gallant David standing against a brutal Goliath. Public sympathy flowed freely, and volunteers began organizing to aid the Finns, particularly in Sweden, where cultural ties were strongest. The League of Nations, under pressure to act, prepared to expel the Soviet Union for its aggression, a symbolic but largely ineffectual gesture. Britain and France debated sending troops, though their motives were more about securing Scandinavian resources than defending Finnish independence. For the moment, Finland's struggle was largely solitary, fought not with the armies of allies, but with the courage of its own people. Still, the moral support from abroad buoyed spirits in Helsinki. Finland's defiance had captured the world's imagination, even as its soldiers faced the harshest of realities. As the days of early December unfolded, the nature of the war became clear to both sides. The Soviets possessed overwhelming numbers and firepower, but they were clumsy, rigid, and unprepared for the unique challenges of winter warfare. The Finns, though outnumbered and under-equipped, wielded mobility, cunning, and knowledge of their homeland like sharpened blades. Every skirmish revealed that this would not be a war of quick victories, but of endurance, sacrifice, and adaptation. The bombing of Helsinki, intended to break Finnish morale, had instead ignited national defiance. Stalin's assumption that Finland would collapse in days was already unraveling. The invasion had begun, but its outcome was far from decided. What was certain was that the small nation of Finland, thrust into the jaws of the Soviet giant, would fight with a tenacity that astonished the world. The Soviet invasion crashed against defenses that were deceptively modest in appearance, yet formidable in design. The Mannerheim line. Stretching across the narrow Karelian Isthmus, this chain of fortifications bore the name of Finland's commander-in-chief, though he himself downplayed its strength. Unlike the massive concrete bunkers of France's Maginot Line, the Finnish defences were a patchwork of trenches, dugouts, reinforced timber shelters, and cleverly camouflaged artillery positions. Many of the fortifications were built by hand, using local materials and shaped by the natural contours of the land. The Finns relied on granite outcrops, frozen lakes, and thick forests as much as on man-made walls. The line was less an unbreakable fortress than a defensive system that forced invaders into narrow, predictable avenues of attack. To the untrained eye, it seemed crude. To Soviet soldiers, it soon became a nightmare. The Mannerheim line was manned by Finnish troops, who knew every hill and hollow of the landscape. They constructed firing lanes that crisscrossed likely Soviet approaches, ensuring that any advance would be met by overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank obstacles, made of steel rails embedded in concrete and disguised by snow, were positioned along roads and choke points. Camouflaged bunkers called courses housed machine guns and small artillery pieces, their firing slits barely visible from a distance. Even the frozen ground itself was weaponized. Engineers laid mines beneath the snow, waiting for Soviet tanks to trigger explosions that would halt entire columns. The line was never meant to stop an invasion indefinitely. Its purpose was to buy time, sap Soviet momentum, and inflict losses heavy enough to make each kilometer gained unbearably costly. And in this it succeeded. But Finnish defense went far beyond fixed fortifications. The army's true strength lay in its small unit tactics, honed through decades of training in forests and lakes. Rather than massing in rigid formations, Finnish soldiers operated in small mobile squads that could strike suddenly and vanish into the trees. Ski troops, gliding silently across snowbound terrain, became the symbol of Finnish ingenuity. With rifles slung over their shoulders and white camouflage blending them into the landscape, they moved faster than tanks and artillery could follow. They harassed supply convoys, ambushed isolated patrols, and cut communications lines. The Red Army, trained for set-piece battles on open plains, struggled to adapt to this style of warfare. Their cumbersome formations, designed for brute force, were no match for the hit-and-run precision of Finnish fighters. The forests became the Finns' greatest ally, turning the invaders' superiority into liability. Every Finnish soldier carried not just weapons but survival skills essential in a land where the temperature could plunge to -40 degrees Celsius. Campfires were concealed beneath pine branches to avoid detection, and snow shelters or quingies provided warmth in the open wilderness. Rations were simple but effective. Rye bread, dried fish, and steaming mugs of coffee kept men going during long patrols. Weapons were cleaned obsessively, for in the bitter cold even a speck of moisture could freeze a rifle's bolt shut. The soldiers' endurance was tested daily, yet morale remained high. They believed they were defending not only their homeland but their families, traditions, and freedom. This sense of purpose gave them a psychological edge, a determination that could not be measured in numbers or firepower. Against overwhelming odds, spirit and skill became Finland's greatest weapons. Among the most feared Finnish tools was the humble Molotov cocktail, crafted from glass bottles filled with gasoline, kerosene, or tar. These improvised incendiaries were named in mockery of Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, who had claimed Soviet bombers were delivering food to starving Finns. When Soviet tanks rumbled into narrow forest roads, Finnish squads would strike from the tree line, hurling flaming bottles onto engine decks and fuel tanks. The infernos disabled vehicles in seconds, trapping their crews inside or forcing them to flee into the snow. Soviet tank units, designed to dominate battlefields with steel and firepower, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to bands of lightly armed men with homemade weapons. The psychological effect was immense. Soldiers in armored behemoths now dreaded the shadows of the forest, where invisible enemies stalked their every move. The Finnish Air Force, though small, also played its part in the defense machine. With fewer than 150 aircraft at the start of the war, it was hopelessly outnumbered by the thousands of Soviet planes. Yet Finnish pilots, flying outdated Brewster Buffaloes and captured Soviet models, fought with astonishing effectiveness. They relied on tactical surprise, attacking Soviet bombers at low altitudes and dispersing before enemy fighters could react. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire, cleverly concealed near cities and military installations, further blunted Soviet air superiority. While Finland could not control the skies, it denied the Soviets the dominance they expected. Each bomber shot down was both a military and a morale victory, proof that David could strike blows against Goliath in the air as well as on the ground. The ingenuity of the Finnish defense was matched by the leadership of Mannerheim himself. From his headquarters in Mikkeli, he oversaw operations with a calm, methodical style that inspired trust. Though he rarely visited the front lines, his reputation as a man of discipline and integrity carried weight among soldiers. He emphasized patience and calculated resistance, warning against rash offensives that could squander lives. His strategy was simple yet profound. Prolong the fight, bleed the Soviets, and hope that time or international intervention might save Finland. Under his guidance, commanders in the field were given flexibility to adapt, trusting their judgment in fast-changing conditions. The decentralized command structure mirrored the decentralized tactics of the Finnish army, enabling swift responses to Soviet movements. Leadership and strategy fused seamlessly with terrain and tactics, creating a defense machine greater than the sum of its parts. As December 1939 unfolded, the Soviets learned the bitter truth: Finland was no easy conquest. The Mannerheim line held firm against repeated assaults, while forests and frozen lakes turned into killing grounds for Red Army divisions. Finnish soldiers, moving on skis and striking with precision, shredded the illusion of Soviet invincibility. For every village burned and every trench stormed, the Soviets paid in blood. Stalin had unleashed his military juggernaut, expecting swift triumph, yet he found his forces ensnared in a war of attrition on frozen soil. The Finnish defense machine, improvised and undersupplied, had revealed itself as one of the most formidable forces of resistance in modern warfare. And as the weeks turned into months, it would push the Red Army to the limits of endurance. The Winter War was fought not only between two armies, but also against an adversary more unforgiving than any human foe, the Arctic winter itself. By December 1939, temperatures across the Karelian Isthmus and central Finland plunged to extremes of -30 and even -40 degrees Celsius. The cold was merciless, biting through wool coats, freezing weapons, and numbing exposed skin in seconds. Soviet soldiers, many conscripts from milder regions of the empire, found themselves woefully unprepared for such conditions. Their heavy brown uniforms, ill-suited for deep snow, offered little insulation against the wind chill. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes before bullets ever did. For the Red Army, every step forward into Finland became a battle not only with defenders, but with nature itself. In contrast, the Finns turned winter into a weapon. Their white camouflage suits rendered them nearly invisible against the snow, while their mobility on skis allowed them to glide silently through forests. A Soviet patrol, trudging in stiff formation, might suddenly find itself under fire from unseen enemies who seemed to materialize and vanish like ghosts. Finnish soldiers moved swiftly, striking supply convoys and withdrawing before Soviet reinforcements could arrive. Their mastery of the terrain and climate was unmatched. They knew how to build snow shelters, insulate their boots with straw, and keep rifle bolts free from freezing moisture. For them, the cold was not an enemy, but an ally, one that leveled the playing field against overwhelming numbers. Where Soviet troops cursed the winter, the Finns embraced it as part of their national identity. The extreme cold reshaped the mechanics of warfare in strange and deadly ways. Soviet tanks, designed for the vast plains of Europe, seized up as lubricants froze solid in their engines. Artillery pieces failed to fire when breech mechanisms jammed with ice. Even small arms became unreliable, with bolts sticking and barrels cracking under the stress of sudden temperature shifts. Soldiers who exhaled too close to their rifles risked freezing the very sites they depended upon. Supply lines broke down as horses and trucks collapsed in snowdrifts, unable to move across the frozen wilderness. What might have been routine logistics in a temperate climate became Herculean tasks in the Finnish winter. Every bullet delivered to the front, every meal prepared for shivering troops, came at enormous cost and effort. The human body, too, was tested to its limits. Frostbite struck indiscriminately, turning skin black and brittle within hours. Soviet medical units were overwhelmed with cases of gangrene, forced to amputate limbs in field hospitals where heat was scarce and sanitation poor. Starvation compounded the suffering, as Soviet supply depots struggled to keep up with the army's vast consumption. Soldiers gnawed on frozen bread so hard it chipped their teeth, or drank snow that offered hydration but no nourishment. The Finns fared better, though even they endured hunger and fatigue. Their rations of rye bread, dried fish, and coffee were simple but sustaining, designed for portability and survival in the field. Yet even among the defenders, malnutrition and exhaustion took a toll, blurring the line between endurance and collapse. Winter transformed the landscape itself into a battlefield ally for Finland. Frozen lakes became highways for ski troops and artillery, enabling sudden maneuvers across terrain impassable in summer. Dense pine forests provided natural cover, muffling sound and concealing movement. Snowdrifts acted as shields, absorbing bullets and shells, while ice-crusted branches obscured observation. For the Soviets, these same features became deadly traps. Armored columns that ventured off narrow roads, often bogged down in snow, immobilized and exposed. Infantrymen who strayed from marked paths risked vanishing into white oblivion, their bodies swallowed by blizzards. In such conditions, even navigation was perilous, with compasses malfunctioning and landmarks hidden beneath endless snow. The environment punished any mistake ruthlessly. Stories from the front revealed how winter shaped the psychology of the war. Soviet soldiers, huddled in poorly heated tents, spoke of hearing Finnish ski troops moving through the forest at night, the whisper of snow beneath skis more terrifying than artillery. Some described hallucinations brought on by cold and exhaustion, seeing phantom enemies in the swirling snow. Finnish troops, though better adapted, were not immune to the strain. Long patrols in the wilderness left men isolated, haunted by silence that pressed down heavier than any bombardment. Yet where the Soviets often sank into despair, the Finns drew strength from their shared suffering, forging camaraderie that sustained them through the darkness. Winter broke men, but it also bound them together in ways peacetime could never replicate. The environment also forced innovation on both sides. The Finns perfected the use of sleds, pulled by reindeer or horses, to move supplies swiftly through snow-covered forests. Soviet engineers attempted to adapt with snowplows and tracked vehicles, but these were few and often failed under the strain. Improvised stoves, crafted from tin cans and fueled with pine branches, became lifelines for soldiers in the field. Fires were carefully hidden, their smoke dispersed into treetops to avoid detection. Ammunition was warmed near campfires to prevent misfires, then rushed into action before freezing again. These small, desperate measures revealed the reality of winter combat. Survival often depended less on firepower than on ingenuity. By January 1940, it was clear that winter had tilted the balance of the war. The Soviets still possessed overwhelming numbers, but their strength was blunted by cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The Finns, though outnumbered, exploited every advantage the climate offered. Each Soviet casualty was not just the result of a bullet or shell, but of an environment that drained the will to fight. Nature itself had become Finland's greatest ally, a silent warrior more relentless than any general. Stalin had expected to conquer a small nation in days, but he had not reckoned with the frozen battlefield that stretched before him. The Winter War was no longer just a clash of armies. It was a contest between human will and the cruelty of nature. The Red Army entered Finland with confidence born not of experience but of sheer numbers. Stalin's generals promised swift victory, assuring him that a poorly armed nation of 4 million could not possibly withstand the Soviet colossus. Yet beneath the surface of this bravado lay rot. The purges of 1937 and 1938 had gutted the officer corps, with thousands of seasoned commanders executed or imprisoned. Their replacements were often political loyalists, men chosen for obedience rather than competence. On the snowy fields of Karelia, this weakness revealed itself with deadly clarity. Orders were inflexible, communication chaotic, and initiative non-existent. Soviet troops advanced in dense formations, as if fighting on the open steppes, only to find themselves swallowed by forests where visibility extended no more than a few meters. What looked unstoppable on paper quickly unraveled in practice. The first humiliations came on the narrow forest roads, where Soviet columns stretched for kilometers. Tanks, trucks, and infantry slogged forward in rigid lines, vulnerable to ambush at every turn. Finnish ski troops, masters of speed and surprise, attacked from the flanks with rifles and machine guns, then vanished into the trees. Soviet units, unaccustomed to such warfare, responded clumsily, firing blindly into the snow while their supply convoys burned behind them. The tactic of Motti, splitting large enemy formations into isolated pockets, proved devastating. Surrounded and cut off, Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped in frozen clearings, starved of food, ammunition, and leadership. For the Finns, these motis became hunting grounds, where small squads methodically destroyed larger forces piece by piece. The mighty Red Army, expected to crush resistance in days, was reduced to scattered, demoralized fragments. At Suomussalmi, one of the war's most famous battles, Soviet incompetence met Finnish ingenuity in brutal fashion. Two Soviet divisions, numbering nearly 45,000 men, advanced through deep snow towards central Finland, believing they could sever the country in two. Instead, they were harassed relentlessly by ski troops numbering fewer than 12,000. The Finns, led by Colonel Halmar Siilasvuo, cut supply lines, destroyed convoys, and attacked isolated units with uncanny precision. Soviet soldiers, freezing in the open wilderness without adequate shelters or clothing, starved as their rations dwindled. Horses collapsed in the snow, trucks bogged down on frozen roads, and tanks stood immobilized by ice. Entire units surrendered or perished where they stood. When the battle ended, Soviet losses exceeded 27,000 men, killed, captured, or missing, compared to fewer than 2,000 Finnish dead. Suomussalmi became a symbol of Finnish resilience and Soviet failure. The psychological toll of these defeats was immense. Soviet soldiers, many conscripts from distant republics, were bewildered by the strange, alien landscape of endless forests and frozen lakes. They feared the silence broken only by the sudden crack of rifle fire from unseen enemies. Stories spread of Finnish snipers, like the legendary Simo Heihe, whose deadly accuracy earned him the nickname White Death. Morale plummeted as units realized they were fighting not just an enemy but the environment itself. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion killed more men than bullets. Discipline faltered, and desertions grew, though escape was nearly impossible in the frozen wilderness. The myth of Soviet invincibility, cultivated by propaganda, was crumbling in the snowdrifts of Finland. Every defeat amplified the sense of futility, turning confidence into despair. Meanwhile, Finnish morale soared as tales of victories spread across the nation. Soldiers who ambushed Soviet columns returned to villages greeted as heroes, their exploits recounted around firesides with awe and pride. Captured Soviet equipment, including tanks and rifles, was repurposed to strengthen the defenders' arsenal. Each success reinforced the belief that ingenuity and courage could outweigh sheer numbers. For the civilian population, these triumphs provided hope during air raids and ration shortages. Even international newspapers carried the stories, portraying Finland as a David striking back against Goliath. The Red Army, expected to sweep effortlessly across the border, had instead handed Finland its greatest propaganda weapon, proof that the giant could bleed. The failures were not only tactical, but logistical. Soviet supply systems, designed for railroads and open plains, collapsed in the deep snow and dense forests. Ammunition failed to reach frontline units, food spoiled in the freezing cold, and fuel for tanks ran dry. Communication lines were severed repeatedly by Finnish raiders, leaving isolated units blind and leaderless. In desperation, Soviet soldiers slaughtered horses for meat, but even this meager sustenance often came too late. Fires, lit for warmth, gave away positions to Finnish artillery spotters. The inefficiency bordered on the catastrophic, revealing an army unprepared for the war it had chosen to fight. While Stalin demanded results, his generals struggled to explain why divisions were disappearing into the forests without achieving their objectives. The Red Army's rigid doctrine magnified its defeats. Commanders insisted on frontal assaults against the Mannerheim line, sending waves of men and machines into concentrated fields of fire. Casualties mounted in horrific numbers, with soldiers cut down by machine guns and artillery as they advanced across open snowfields. Tanks, advancing without infantry support, were immobilized by mines and destroyed by Molotov cocktails. Rather than adapt to the reality of Finnish tactics, many Soviet officers repeated the same mistakes, driven by fear of Stalin's wrath if they admitted failure. The purges had created a culture where obedience was valued above competence, and innovation was dangerous. The cost was measured in thousands of lives, sacrificed in futile attempts to overwhelm Finnish defences by sheer force. By January 1940, the Red Army's early campaign lay in ruins, its weaknesses exposed to the world. What Stalin had envisioned as a quick and decisive victory had turned into a humiliation that shook the Soviet Union to its core. Finland, though small and isolated, had demonstrated that courage, cunning, and knowledge of terrain could defy even the largest armies. The early failures forced Stalin to reconsider his approach, leading to sweeping changes in strategy and command. Yet for the moment, the battlefield belonged to Finland. The Red Army had stumbled, bleeding heavily in the snow while the defenders stood unbroken. The war was far from over, but the first act had revealed a truth that reverberated across the globe: the Soviet giant was not invincible. The battle for Suomussalmi began in the bleak heart of the Finnish winter, where temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees and the forests stretched endlessly beneath a pale sun. Stalin had ordered two entire Soviet divisions, the 163rd and 44th, to advance through this remote region, believing they could slice Finland in half and sever communications between north and south. Nearly 45,000 men, supported by tanks, trucks, and artillery, trudged into the wilderness with little knowledge of the terrain or the people who defended it. They carried with them a vision of swift conquest, but the snow and ice conspired against them from the first march. Frozen roads limited movement, food supplies lagged behind, and the men lacked proper winter clothing. Their advance soon became a nightmare of stalled columns stretching across miles of road. Watching from the forests, Finnish scouts saw opportunity in every mistake, and Colonel Halmar Siela's view began shaping the trap that would turn disaster into legend. The Finnish commander understood the Red Army's weakness lay not in its numbers, but in its rigidity. Soviet formations clung to the roads, unwilling or unable to maneuver through the forests, where their tanks bogged down and their trucks froze. Silas Vuo's troops, numbering fewer than 12,000, moved on skis across the snow with uncanny speed, striking from angles the Soviets never anticipated. They mastered the tactic of the moti, isolating enemy columns into pockets, cutting them into manageable fragments, and then starving them of food, fuel, and communication. Each Soviet regiment became a trapped island, surrounded by silent figures in white camouflage. At night, Finnish soldiers set ambushes on supply convoys, igniting them with Molotov cocktails, and by day they harassed positions until Soviet morale broke. Against overwhelming odds, the smaller force had found a way to turn mobility and terrain into lethal weapons. The village of Suomussalmi itself became the focal point of the clash. The Soviet 163rd Division occupied the settlement in December 1939, believing it could serve as a base for operations deeper into Finland. Yet the village quickly became a trap, cut off from its supply lines and encircled by Finnish troops. Inside the burning houses and frozen ruins, Soviet soldiers huddled together, starving and frostbitten, as Finnish ski patrols stalked their every movement. Artillery shells rained down, shattering what little shelter they had, While Finnish sharpshooters picked off men who strayed into the open, panic set in as the realization dawned that no relief would come. Each attempt to break free from the tightening circle failed, leaving the garrison weaker and more desperate. Suomussalmi, once a prize, had become a death sentence. To the south, the Soviet 44th Division marched to rescue its comrades, but fell victim to the same merciless strategy. Advancing along a single narrow road through deep snow, the column stretched for miles, its vehicles vulnerable and its men exposed. Finnish ski troops struck with devastating efficiency, cutting the column into pieces, igniting fuel trucks, and blocking the road with felled trees. Isolated pockets of Soviet soldiers fought desperately in makeshift camps, building bonfires that only revealed their positions to the enemy. Ammunition dwindled, food supplies vanished, and frostbite claimed more lives than bullets. The road became a graveyard of shattered vehicles, frozen bodies, and abandoned weapons. By the time the fighting ended, the 44th Division had been annihilated, its remnants destroyed or captured in a series of relentless ambushes. The numbers told a story as brutal as the battlefield itself. Out of nearly 45,000 Soviet soldiers committed to the Suomussalmi campaign, more than 27,000 were killed, captured, or went missing in action. In contrast, the Finns suffered fewer than 2,000 dead, a staggering disparity that stunned observers worldwide. The victory was not merely a tactical triumph, but a psychological one, proving that small, determined forces could defeat vast armies through ingenuity and willpower. The capture of Soviet equipment, hundreds of trucks, dozens of tanks, and vast stores of ammunition, gave Finland precious resources it could never have produced on its own. The myth of Soviet invincibility was shattered in the snow, and Finland's legend as a nation of unbreakable fighters was born. Suomussalmi became not just a battle, but a symbol of endurance against impossible odds. For the men who fought it, the experience was etched into memory as both triumph and trauma. Finnish soldiers recalled nights of bitter cold, when sleep meant death and survival depended on constant movement. They spoke of comrades freezing in foxholes, of hands blistered from handling rifles in subzero temperatures, and of the haunting cries of starving Soviet soldiers echoing through the forests. Soviet survivors remembered the despair of isolation, the endless hunger, and the bitter realization that their commanders had abandoned them to die in the snow. The human cost was measured not only in lives lost, but in the scars carried by those who endured. Behind the statistics lay thousands of stories of suffering, courage, and the sheer will to survive. International reaction to the battle was immediate and powerful. Newspapers across Europe and America carried the headlines of Finland's stunning victory, painting the nation as a valiant David standing against the Soviet Goliath. Volunteers from abroad were inspired to travel to Finland, believing they were joining a righteous fight against tyranny. For Hitler and the German High Command, the Red Army's humiliating defeat confirmed their belief that the Soviets were weak and disorganized, a miscalculation that would have catastrophic consequences years later. For the Allies, the battle stirred admiration but little action, as Britain and France remained unwilling to intervene directly. Suomussalmi thus became both a beacon of hope and a tragic reminder of Finland's isolation on the world stage. Yet even as Finland celebrated its victory, the leadership understood that the war was far from over. The Red Army was vast, its resources nearly limitless, and Stalin would not accept defeat at the hands of a smaller neighbor. For every division lost, another could be raised, better equipped and better commanded. Suomussalmi was a warning as much as a triumph, a demonstration that Finland could win battles but not necessarily the war. Still, in the dark winter of 1939, it gave the nation something priceless: belief. belief that courage, unity, and strategy could defy overwhelming odds. The Battle of Suomussalmi entered legend, not just as a military victory, but as a testament to the resilience of a people determined to remain free. Among the frozen forests of the Winter War, a figure emerged whose legend would terrify Soviet soldiers and inspire Finns for generations: Simo Häyhä, known as the White Death. Standing just over 5 feet tall, Häyhä was an unassuming farmer and hunter from Karelia, who brought with him the patience of the woods and the unerring aim of a lifetime spent tracking game. He fought with a simple Finnish Mosin nugget rifle without a scope, preferring iron sights to avoid the glare of sunlight that might betray his position. Clad in white camouflage, he melted into the snowbanks, invisible save for the faint puff of breath in the freezing air. Over the course of just 100 days, he is credited with more than 500 confirmed kills, a figure that made him one of the deadliest snipers in history. For the Soviets who advanced into the forests, the mere whisper of the White Death was enough to stir panic in their ranks. Häyhä was not alone in his deadly craft. Finnish sharpshooters turned the battlefield into a gallery of silent executions. Armed with rifles, keen eyesight, and deep familiarity with their environment, these marksmen targeted Soviet officers, machine gun crews, and communication runners. Each shot was a calculated disruption, fraying the cohesion of the Red Army at its weakest points. Soviet soldiers quickly learned that to raise their heads above a trench or pause too long in an open clearing was to risk sudden death. Even Soviet snipers, often equipped with scopes and better weapons, struggled to match the Finns' mastery of camouflage and patience. The forest itself seemed alive with unseen eyes, every tree a possible hiding place for a Finnish rifleman. Their presence magnified the psychological terror of fighting in unfamiliar terrain. Finnish guerrilla fighters extended this terror into every corner of the front. Small ski patrols cut deep into Soviet rear areas, attacking supply depots, fuel convoys, and isolated units before vanishing into the snowy wilderness. These raiders operated in silence, often moving at night under the cover of snowstorms, striking when their enemies were least prepared. They left behind smoldering vehicles, abandoned weapons, and bodies frozen in the snow. To the Soviets, they seemed less like soldiers than wraiths, appearing and disappearing with unnatural speed. Guerrilla warfare blurred the boundaries between front and rear, leaving no place safe for the invaders. Every fire lit for warmth risked drawing Finnish eyes, and every sound in the forest might be the herald of an ambush. The tactics of these Finnish fighters reflected their environment and their culture. Ski warfare was second nature to men who had grown up hunting across frozen lakes and dense forests. They could cover 30 kilometers in a day without roads, slipping between Soviet units that lumbered forward on narrow tracks. Sleighs carried supplies and wounded men, while reindeer were sometimes used to haul equipment through deep drifts. Communication was achieved through runners, whistles, and prearranged signals, minimizing the need for radios that could be intercepted. The Finns understood that speed, stealth, and surprise were their greatest weapons, compensating for the lack of heavy armor and artillery. In the hands of such fighters, the vast wilderness of Finland itself became a weapon sharpened by experience. Stories of individual heroism became part of the fabric of national morale. Alongside Häyhä, men like Lauri Turney, later known as Larry Thorne, gained reputations for daring raids and impossible survivals. Small groups held positions for days against overwhelming forces, retreating only when out of ammunition or surrounded. Villages celebrated tales of young farm boys who brought down Soviet tanks with nothing more than Molotov cocktails and courage. These stories passed from camp to camp, stiffened Finnish resolve, and offered proof that determination could match numbers. Even when the casualty lists grew, The idea that a single man could change the course of a battle kept hope alive in the darkest nights. Legends were born in the snow, their power magnified by the desperation of the war. For Soviet soldiers, these Finnish heroes became figures of dread. Survivors of skirmishes told tales of comrades picked off by invisible snipers, of convoys burned in sudden ambushes, and of endless harassment that robbed them of sleep and sanity. Entire regiments grew wary of moving without heavy escort, slowing their advances and straining supply lines further. Soviet commanders, frustrated by their inability to root out Finnish guerrillas, sometimes resorted to indiscriminate shelling of forests, wasting ammunition against empty snow. In their fear, they came to respect the cunning of their adversaries, even as they cursed the cold and the endless trees that shielded them. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by divisions and battalions, but by the lethal skill of individuals whose names carried weight far beyond their numbers. Simo Häyhä's story, in particular, reached mythic proportions even before the war ended. Soviet efforts to eliminate him became an obsession, with artillery barrages directed against his suspected positions and snipers sent to hunt him down. In March 1940, he was finally struck by an explosive bullet to the jaw, leaving his face shattered and his life hanging by a thread. Yet he survived, waking from a coma on the very day peace was signed. His resilience mirrored that of Finland itself, scarred, battered, but unbroken. For the Finns, Häyhä embodied the spirit of defiance, proving that one determined individual could wield a power greater than whole battalions. His story spread across the world, cementing the legend of the White Death. The legacy of these heroes of the snows transcended their immediate victories. They demonstrated that warfare was not solely a matter of numbers and machines, but also of ingenuity, patience, and the will to fight on one's own terms. Their courage gave Finland the moral strength to endure a conflict that seemed unwinnable. They inspired future generations, not as figures of myth alone, but as proof of the resilience of a small nation against a giant. In the white silence of the Finnish winter, their rifles cracked like thunder, echoing far beyond the forests where they once fought. The snows themselves seemed to bear witness to their deeds, preserving their memory as long as Finland remained free. The heart of the Winter War was fought on the Karelian Isthmus, a narrow stretch of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga that shielded the approaches to Helsinki. Here lay the Mannerheim line, Finland's main line of fortifications, named after the veteran general who had designed its concept in the years after independence. It was not, as Soviet propaganda claimed, an unbreakable fortress of concrete and steel, but rather a patchwork of bunkers, trenches, and natural barriers woven into the rocky landscape. Dense forests, lakes, and marshes gave the Finns their greatest advantage, turning geography into a defense as formidable as any wall. Soviet intelligence had underestimated its resilience, believing massed firepower could shatter it within days. Instead, the Isthmus became the crucible of Finland's survival, where soldiers and civilians alike prepared to resist with every ounce of strength. The Soviet plan was straightforward: unleash overwhelming force against the Finnish defenses and grind them into submission. By mid-December 1939, nearly 500,000 Red Army troops massed along the Isthmus, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, and aircraft. Waves of infantry were hurled against Finnish lines in assaults that seemed endless, each preceded by barrages that tore apart the frozen earth. Yet for every Soviet breakthrough, the Finns countered with fierce determination, using the terrain to their advantage. Machine gun nests concealed in bunkers opened fire on advancing columns, mowing down attackers who stumbled across snowfields with no cover. Anti-tank rifles and improvised Molotov cocktails turned Finnish infantry into tank hunters, striking fear into Soviet crews trapped in narrow approaches. The Soviets found themselves fighting not only entrenched defenders, but a people determined to resist annihilation. Inside the Mannerheim line, the Finnish defenders endured conditions as brutal as the enemy's assaults. Soldiers shivered in dugouts heated by makeshift stoves, rationing food and ammunition while bracing for the next bombardment. Every day brought new casualties, and every night was filled with the groans of the wounded echoing through frozen trenches. Medical units worked with meager supplies, performing surgeries in dimly lit shelters where blood froze on the floor. Yet morale held, sustained by a mixture of national pride, discipline, and trust in their commander, Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. His presence on the front was not just symbolic but essential, as he visited the lines, speaking directly to soldiers, and reminding them that they defended not just territory, but the very existence of Finland. His calm authority steadied men who faced impossible odds. Soviet commanders, frustrated by their lack of progress, resorted to sheer weight of numbers. Assault after assault was launched, often with little regard for coordination or supply. Entire regiments advanced shoulder to shoulder across snowy fields, becoming easy targets for Finnish machine guns and mortars. Tanks rolled forward without infantry support, only to be ambushed and destroyed in narrow forest roads. Artillery shells cratered the landscape, but the Finns dug deep into the earth, emerged once the barrages lifted and resumed their deadly fire. The Red Army's rigid hierarchy left little room for improvisation, and officers who questioned orders risked punishment. The result was a cycle of wasteful attacks that bled Soviet divisions white without breaking the defenders. The Isthmus became a killing ground where courage clashed with futility. For the Finns, victory was measured not in territory gained, but in time bought. Each day the Mannerheim line held was a day Finland remained independent, and each Soviet failure exposed the weaknesses of Stalin's war machine. Foreign observers watched in astonishment as reports emerged of entire Soviet regiments cut down in a single day, of tanks littering the forests like frozen hulks. Yet the strain on the defenders grew unbearable. Ammunition stocks dwindled, replacements were scarce, and exhaustion gnawed at every man in the trenches. Winter offered some protection, but it also punished the defenders with frostbite, hunger, and constant fatigue. Every moment was a test of endurance, where survival depended as much on will as on weapons. Civilians in nearby towns and villages played their part, supporting the front with supplies, clothing, and medical aid. Women organized relief efforts, knitting socks and mittens that became as vital as bullets in the freezing conditions. Farmers donated food, hunters lent their rifles, and volunteers worked to build and repair fortifications. The war on the Isthmus was not fought by soldiers alone, but by the entire Finnish nation, united in the belief that their independence was worth any sacrifice. Stories spread of young boys carrying messages across the lines on skis, of old men standing guard in villages to free younger men for the front. The home front and the battlefield became inseparable, each feeding the other's resilience. The cost to the Soviets was staggering, and reports of failure began to unsettle even Stalin's inner circle. The Red Army, touted as a juggernaut of modern warfare, had been humbled by a nation 1/20th its size. Soviet propaganda insisted victory was near, but the reality was undeniable. Morale was collapsing, and casualties were mounting by the tens of thousands. Commanders began to question the quality of their training, the reliability of their equipment, and the wisdom of their leaders' orders. Rumors spread among the troops of Finnish ghosts, who struck from the snow and vanished, leaving only death behind. The Isthmus was proving that modern armies could falter when arrogance collided with determination. Yet for all the Finnish successes, cracks began to show by January 1940. The Red Army, learning from its mistakes, adapted its tactics, and brought in more experienced commanders, supplies improved, fresh divisions replaced shattered ones, and artillery fire became more concentrated. Slowly but relentlessly, the Soviets began to grind down the defences of the Mannerheim line. For Finland, every metre of ground held now came at a terrible cost in blood and suffering. The struggle for the Isthmus was not over, but the balance was beginning to shift. What had once seemed a triumph of the few over the many was turning into a war of attrition that even Finland's courage might not withstand. The fate of the nation hung in the trenches of Karelia. When the first reports of Soviet bombers striking Helsinki on November 30th, 1939 reached Western newspapers, the world reacted with shock and indignation. Headlines in London, Paris, and New York described the Red Army's invasion of a small democratic nation as a blatant act of aggression. Finland was quickly cast as a David against a Soviet Goliath, and sympathy for the Finns spread rapidly across political lines. Photographs of civilians huddling in bombed-out streets and children bundled against the snow appeared alongside images of Finnish soldiers in white camouflage. For many readers, the contrast was stark: a tiny nation defending its freedom against the might of one of the largest armies on earth. Editorials denounced Stalin's brutality and praised Finnish resilience, amplifying Finland's reputation as a nation of heroes. Public rallies in Stockholm, Copenhagen, and Budapest declared solidarity with Finland, turning sympathy into active support. Across the world, people began to ask what role they could play in the unfolding drama. International opinion had made Finland's struggle a global story, and the Winter War became more than a regional conflict. The international press fueled this perception with vivid storytelling that bordered on myth-making. Journalists embedded near the front described Finnish ski patrols slipping like phantoms through the forests. They told of Soviet tanks being destroyed by Molotov cocktails hurled from treetops, of snipers hidden in snowbanks who struck terror with unseen precision. These tales often exaggerated the scale of Finnish successes, but captured the imagination of readers hungry for stories of courage. The White Death, Simo Hay, became a household name in Europe even before the war had ended, his deeds elevated to almost supernatural proportions. Newspapers drew parallels with classical epics, portraying Finland as the modern Thermopylae, holding back an Asiatic horde. This romanticized narrative, though simplified, was vital for Finland's diplomatic position. It created a groundswell of moral outrage against Moscow that Finland could leverage for aid. The pen, as much as the rifle, was shaping the battle's legacy. Sympathy was strongest among Finland's Nordic neighbours, where cultural and historical ties ran deep. In Sweden, public opinion overwhelmingly favoured aiding Finland, and thousands of volunteers signed up for service in the Swedish Volunteer Corps. By early 1940, more than 8,000 Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes had crossed the border to fight alongside Finnish forces. These men brought with them not only rifles but also valuable expertise in skiing, cold weather survival, and modern weaponry. Although they were limited in number compared to the Red Army's mass, their presence boosted Finnish morale and symbolized international solidarity. Sweden, officially neutral, walked a delicate line, supplying volunteers and weapons while avoiding direct war with the Soviet Union. Norway too contributed smaller groups of men, despite its vulnerable position between two great powers. Even distant nations felt compelled to act, showing that Finland's cause had transcended borders. In every sense, the Winter War had become a European affair. Hungary emerged as one of Finland's most passionate supporters, driven by both cultural affinity and political calculation. Hungarians saw Finns as distant cousins, linked through the Finno-Ugric language family, and rallies in Budapest portrayed the war as a defense of kinship. The Hungarian government, despite pressure from Germany and the Soviet Union, allowed volunteers to travel north. By the war's end, several hundred Hungarians had joined the fight, their presence celebrated by Finnish troops, who embraced them as brothers. Aid societies across Hungary collected donations of clothing, money, and medical supplies to ship to Finland. This outpouring of support demonstrated how deeply the Winter War resonated beyond immediate geography. In Hungary, it became not just a war of survival, but a symbol of shared heritage. Though small in scale, this assistance carried immense symbolic weight. It confirmed that Finland was not alone in its ordeal. Further afield, sympathy came from Western democracies, though their support was more cautious and political. In Britain and France, public opinion favored intervention, and serious discussions took place about sending troops to assist Finland. Plans were drawn up for an expeditionary force to land in Norway and Sweden, ostensibly to aid Finland, but also to cut off Germany's access to Swedish iron ore. Yet the complexities of geopolitics stalled these plans, and ultimately they were never realized. Still, military supplies trickled in, from rifles and artillery shells to aircraft, providing Finland with badly needed material. In the United States, President Roosevelt expressed admiration for Finland's courage and authorized humanitarian aid. American citizens donated millions of dollars to relief funds, while Finnish-American communities rallied in support. Even without direct military intervention, the moral and material backing from the West sustained Finland's struggle. The world's democracies had chosen their side, if not yet with their armies, then with their hearts. Despite these expressions of solidarity, Finland remained painfully aware of its isolation. Volunteers were brave, donations were generous, but against the sheer mass of the Soviet Union, they were drops in a frozen sea. Finnish leaders understood that no Western army would march across Europe in time to save them. Yet they also grasped the value of global attention. For every article written and every volunteer who arrived increased the diplomatic cost of Stalin's aggression. The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations in December 1939, a symbolic but significant condemnation. International outrage painted the Red Army as a bully and Finland as its victim. This moral dimension mattered, even if it did not stop the shells falling on the Mannerheim line. Finland's leaders exploited every ounce of sympathy they received, knowing it might prove crucial in the negotiations to come. Their struggle was not just military, but diplomatic, and the world was watching. For the ordinary Finnish soldier, the sight of foreign volunteers arriving was a profound boost to morale. They were proof that their fight was not forgotten beyond the snowbound forests of Karelia. Stories spread of Swedish volunteers braving the same frostbitten trenches, of Hungarian comrades singing strange songs around campfires, of Americans donating planes painted with Finnish insignia. These symbols of solidarity gave meaning to sacrifice, binding Finland's war to a broader human cause. It was no longer only about defending villages and cities, but about embodying freedom itself. For a small nation under siege, this recognition mattered as much as bullets or shells. It showed that the world had not abandoned them entirely. Even in the coldest nights, hope could still burn. The global attention paid to the Winter War shaped its place in history as much as the battles themselves. Finland's resistance became a rallying cry for small nations everywhere, proving that defiance could inspire even against impossible odds. The volunteers and donations, while limited in military effect, created a legacy of shared struggle that endured long after the war ended. For Stalin, international condemnation was an embarrassment that stained Soviet prestige at a time when alliances were being tested. For Finland, it was a source of pride and moral strength, a reminder that their fight was not in vain. In the end, the Winter War was both a national tragedy and a global drama. It captured imaginations across continents leaving a mark on the collective memory of the world, and in that memory, Finland's courage would never be forgotten. As the Winter War raged in the frozen forests of Finland, far from the battlefield, the cabinets of London and Paris were locked in heated debate. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Edouard Daladier faced immense pressure from their publics, who demanded action in support of heroic Finland. In the eyes of many, the Soviet Union's aggression presented an opportunity to strike against totalitarianism, and aiding Finland seemed both morally right and strategically useful. Yet beneath the surface of sympathy, darker calculations were at play. Both Britain and France feared Germany's growing power and sought ways to cut off its access to Swedish iron ore. The mines of northern Sweden fed Hitler's war machine, and controlling that supply became a tantalizing prospect. By disguising intervention in Finland as a noble cause, London and Paris saw a chance to weaken Germany indirectly. Finland's suffering thus became entangled with the larger chessboard of European strategy. The plans discussed were audacious in scope and fraught with risk. Allied leaders proposed sending an expeditionary force of 100,000 men, drawn from both British and French divisions. These troops would land at Norwegian ports, march across Swedish territory, and finally reach Finland to bolster its defences against the Red Army. On paper, it was a plan filled with noble purpose and bold ambition. In practice, it was riddled with complications and potential disaster. Neither Norway nor Sweden wished to be dragged into the war, fearing German retaliation and Soviet wrath alike. Both governments clung tightly to neutrality, wary of becoming pawns in a conflict between great powers. For Britain and France, this reluctance posed an enormous obstacle. To proceed without permission would mean violating sovereignty, potentially creating new enemies instead of allies. Every discussion revealed that the road to Finland was blocked not just by snow but by politics. British military planners were divided on the feasibility of such an operation. Some saw in it the chance to redeem Britain's reputation after the humiliating inaction during the fall of Poland. Others warned that logistical challenges alone would doom the effort before a single soldier reached the Finnish front. Moving large forces across icy fjords, through mountainous terrain, and along railways already strained by winter conditions seemed nearly impossible. Supplies, fuel, and heavy weapons would have to cross hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. Even if the troops arrived, their presence would likely provoke Germany to invade Norway, seizing the very iron ore routes Britain hoped to secure. The risk of escalation loomed large, and many wondered if saving Finland was worth endangering Scandinavia. Still, the moral pressure from public opinion could not be ignored. Britain was caught between conscience and caution, between what the people demanded and what the generals feared. In France, the debate carried its own urgency. The French government, locked in a defensive posture behind the Maginot Line, sought opportunities to weaken Germany without direct confrontation. Finland's plight offered just such a chance, an indirect blow against both the Soviets and Germany in one move. French newspapers championed intervention, calling it a duty of civilization to save a fellow democracy. Yet within the French High Command, skepticism ran deep. Generals doubted that French troops, already weary from months of inactivity, could be spared for a distant winter campaign. They feared weakening the defences of France while embarking on an adventure far beyond their logistical capacity. Still, Daladier pressed for bold action, believing international prestige demanded France stand with Finland. His government viewed the conflict as an opportunity to prove France was not passive in the face of aggression. This tension revealed the fragile balance between public pressure and military reality. While Britain and France argued, Finnish diplomats pleaded desperately for aid. They travelled from capital to capital, presenting evidence of Soviet atrocities and appealing to the ideals of democracy. The images of bombed cities and frozen civilians tugged at hearts, but the promises made in return were slow and uncertain. Weapons shipments were offered, but often too late or too small to turn the tide. Volunteers were welcomed, but the divisions Finland needed remained tied up in debates across distant chancelleries. Every delay cost lives on the front lines, where Finnish soldiers struggled against waves of Soviet assaults. The gap between rhetoric and reality grew painfully clear in Helsinki. Finland was hailed as heroic abroad, but left largely to fight alone. The chasm between sympathy and action deepened as winter dragged on. Meanwhile, Germany watched the Allied debates with keen interest. Hitler recognized that Allied intervention in Scandinavia would directly threaten his access to Swedish iron ore. He began preparing contingency plans for an invasion of Norway, a move that would later shape the course of the wider war. For the Germans, the prospect of Britain and France landing troops in Scandinavia was both a threat and an opportunity. If the Allies acted rashly, Germany could justify a preemptive strike, securing vital resources and strategic bases along the Norwegian coast. Thus, the debates in London and Paris did not go unnoticed in Berlin. Every hesitation, every delay played into Hitler's hands. Finland's war became one thread in a larger tapestry of European strategy, where the stakes were far greater than one nation's survival. The shadow of wider conflict loomed ever larger over Scandinavia. In Norway and Sweden, the proposed intervention caused alarm and indignation. Both nations, small and vulnerable, were determined to maintain neutrality at almost any cost. Norwegian leaders feared that allowing Allied troops to land would invite immediate German invasion. Swedish leaders, equally cautious, knew their iron ore mines were coveted by both sides and sought to avoid provoking war. Public opinion in both countries leaned towards sympathy for Finland, but governments prioritized survival. They offered humanitarian aid, medical supplies, and limited volunteers, but refused to grant passage to Allied armies. Their neutrality was fragile but fiercely guarded, and any violation would likely plunge Scandinavia into chaos. Thus, the Allied plans stalled before they even began. The road to Finland remained closed, blocked by the resolve of neutral neighbors. Diplomacy had failed to break the deadlock. Ultimately, the debates over intervention revealed the limitations of Allied power. In early 1940, Britain and France had the will to make promises but not the means to act decisively. Their armies were tied to defensive strategies, their leaders hesitant to take risks, and their publics demanding boldness without understanding the costs. Finland had become a symbol, a cause célèbre, but not a priority worth war with Germany or the Soviet Union. As Soviet pressure mounted on the Mannerheim line, the long-discussed expeditionary force remained nothing more than paper plans. When peace was finally signed in March 1940, the Allied debates faded into history as a chapter of missed opportunities. Yet their consequences echoed beyond the Winter War. The paralysis of London and Paris foreshadowed the failures that would come later that year, when Germany's blitzkrieg overwhelmed Western Europe. For Finland, the debates were a bitter reminder that sympathy did not always bring salvation. The humiliations of December 1939 forced Joseph Stalin to confront a reality he had long ignored: the Red Army was not invincible. Weeks of disastrous assaults on the Mannerheim line and humiliating defeats at places like Suomussalmi exposed deep flaws in Soviet command and preparation. Reports poured into Moscow detailing frozen corpses, shattered tank columns, and divisions annihilated by far smaller Finnish forces. Stalin, enraged but pragmatic, realized the war could not be won by sheer numbers alone. He ordered a sweeping reorganization of command, removing incompetent officers who had proven incapable in the field. Experienced leaders such as Semyon Timoshenko were brought in to restore discipline and efficiency. The political commissars, who had often undermined professional military decisions, saw their influence temporarily curtailed. Stalin, for once, allowed his generals to learn from failure and adapt their strategies accordingly. The Winter War was no longer a simple punitive campaign, but a test of the Red Army's ability to evolve. This shift would prove decisive in the months to come. One of the greatest lessons learned was the need for overwhelming and concentrated firepower. The Soviets had previously relied on piecemeal attacks, throwing waves of infantry against Finnish defences with minimal coordination. These assaults, predictable and uncoordinated, had been shredded by Finnish machine guns and anti-tank ambushes. Timoshenko and his staff recognized that to break the Mannerheim line, they would need artillery on an unprecedented scale. By January 1940, thousands of guns were brought forward, ranging from light mortars to massive howitzers capable of leveling bunkers. Ammunition stockpiles were built up carefully, ensuring days of continuous bombardment could be sustained. Soviet engineers studied captured Finnish defenses and adapted their tactics to systematically target weak points. Rather than rushing blindly, they began preparing calculated offensives that relied on artillery to smash resistance before infantry advanced. It was a lesson written in blood, but the Red Army was finally beginning to adjust. The scale of firepower assembled would soon dwarf anything Finland had ever faced. The Soviets also learned to adapt their armor tactics to the unforgiving terrain. Early in the war, tanks had been sent charging down narrow forest roads without support, only to be destroyed by Molotov cocktails or immobilized in snowdrifts. By February, Soviet planners began integrating tanks with infantry more effectively, coordinating assaults instead of scattering them piecemeal. Specialized engineering units cleared paths through snow and built makeshift bridges across frozen streams. Flamethrowers and satchel charges were assigned to tank infantry teams to deal with Finnish bunkers. Mechanized columns were now supported by artillery barrages that softened resistance ahead of their advance. Although Finnish soldiers still found ways to destroy Soviet armor, the sheer numbers being deployed became overwhelming. The Red Army fielded not dozens but hundreds of tanks in concentrated assaults. These armored spearheads, once symbols of chaos, were now tools of methodical destruction. The mistakes of December would not be repeated so easily. Command and control also underwent critical reforms. Stalin approved the consolidation of scattered Soviet divisions into larger, more cohesive formations capable of coordinating attacks across wide fronts. Communications were improved through greater use of radios, ensuring orders flowed with more speed and clarity than before. Generals were encouraged, albeit cautiously, to use initiative rather than blindly obey directives from Moscow. The chain of command became more professional, with tactical planning given greater weight than political dogma. The Red Army, once paralyzed by purges and micromanagement, began to function with something resembling modern efficiency. Failures were still punished harshly, but success was finally rewarded, creating an incentive for innovation. This change in leadership culture allowed Soviet commanders to exploit weaknesses in Finnish defenses more effectively. Combined arms tactics replaced massed human waves, making Soviet offensives deadlier and harder to resist. For Finland, the reprieve granted by Soviet incompetence was drawing to an end. A storm of new discipline and order was gathering on the Isthmus. The Finnish defenders, watching from their trenches, quickly noticed the change in Soviet methods. Where once Soviet infantry had marched headlong into gunfire, they now advanced cautiously under protective barrages. Where tanks had previously been isolated, they now worked in tandem with artillery and infantry. The pounding of Soviet guns became relentless, lasting for hours or even days before attacks commenced. Finnish bunkers that had withstood weeks of assaults were systematically destroyed by concentrated fire. Machine gun nests were buried under landslides of snow and earth caused by heavy shells. For the first time, the defenders of the Mannerheim line began to feel their positions truly shaken. Casualties mounted, and the strain on the soldiers grew unbearable. The atmosphere in the trenches shifted from defiance to grim endurance. The balance of power, once tilted by Finnish ingenuity, was being redrawn by Soviet adaptation. Soviet logistics also improved, addressing one of the greatest weaknesses of the early campaign. Supply lines that had collapsed under the strain of winter were reorganized with greater efficiency. Railway hubs were expanded, convoys better protected, and depots stocked with food, fuel, and ammunition. Fresh divisions were rotated to the front, relieving exhausted units and boosting morale. Winter clothing, belatedly issued in greater numbers, reduced the crippling frostbite casualties that had plagued Soviet ranks. Soldiers received better rations, and field hospitals were equipped with more supplies to treat the wounded. For the first time, the Red Army showed signs of logistical resilience in the face of Finland's harsh environment. It did not eliminate the hardships of war, but it ensured that Soviet offensives could be sustained longer and with greater force. The tide of the campaign was beginning to turn not just through strategy, but through organization. Stalin's machine was grinding into shape. As February progressed, the full weight of Soviet adaptation bore down on the Karelian Isthmus. The renewed offensives were marked by precision bombardments, coordinated assaults, and a grim determination to crush Finland once and for all. Finnish positions that had held for weeks crumbled under days of unrelenting artillery fire. Entire sections of the Mannerheim line were flattened, leaving defenders exposed and vulnerable. Finnish counterattacks, once devastating, now struggled to make an impact against superior firepower. Even the famous ski patrols, so effective in harassing Soviet lines, found themselves increasingly irrelevant in the face of concentrated offensives. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, was demonstrating its capacity for learning. Stalin's gamble of allowing adaptation had paid off. The Finnish army now faced not just a giant, but a giant that had awakened. The outcome of the war was shifting with every bombardment. For Stalin, these adjustments were vindication, proof that the Red Army could recover from humiliation and impose its will. He had turned disaster into a crucible, reshaping his military through trial by fire. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of lives lost, divisions shattered, reputations destroyed, but the lessons were real. The Soviet war machine, once mocked as clumsy and incompetent, was now showing flashes of the brutal efficiency that would define it in years to come. For Finland, the change was catastrophic, for their best chance of survival had rested on Soviet weakness. Now they faced an enemy that had learned, adapted, and returned with overwhelming might. The Mannerheim line was beginning to buckle under the pressure, and the endgame was drawing near. The Winter War was entering its most desperate phase. Survival now hung by a thread of endurance and diplomacy. Stalin had adapted, and Finland was running out of time. By February 1940, the weight of the Soviet war machine bore down on the Finnish defences with unrelenting force. Weeks of concentrated artillery fire had turned once impregnable bunkers into piles of shattered concrete and frozen rubble. The Mannerheim line, a symbol of Finnish defiance, was now being tested to its absolute breaking point. Soviet gunners fired over 300,000 shells in a matter of days, blanketing the isthmus in smoke, fire, and thunder. Finnish soldiers, who had endured months of fighting, crouched in dugouts with their ears ringing and nerves frayed. Mortar shells burst in snowdrifts, showering the trenches with deadly fragments of ice and steel. Machine gunners, once able to repel wave after wave, now faced foes advancing under an umbrella of fire. The air itself seemed alive with destruction, each explosion reshaping the battlefield into a wasteland. The Soviets had learned their lessons, and this time they were determined not to fail. The storm of February would finally crack the defenders' iron will. The Soviet breakthrough came at the key sector of Summer, where Finnish defences had long been strained. Here, heavy artillery and direct tank assaults combined to smash strongpoints that had resisted earlier attacks. Finnish bunkers, undermanned and exhausted, were pulverized by concentrated fire and flamethrowers. The Red Army launched massive coordinated infantry pushes, supported by hundreds of tanks advancing in close formation. Finnish defenders tried to counter with Molotov cocktails and small arms, but their weapons were no match for overwhelming numbers. Anti-tank guns knocked out dozens of vehicles, yet fresh waves simply rolled over the frozen fields. The once nimble defenders, who had thrived on ambushes, were now pinned in static positions with no escape. Soviet infantry poured into breaches, overwhelming trench lines with bayonets and grenades. Communications collapsed as runners were killed, telephones cut, and chaos spread. The long-feared collapse of the Mannerheim line had finally begun. The situation for the Finnish defenders quickly turned desperate. Reinforcements were scarce, ammunition was dwindling, and exhaustion gnawed at every soldier. Commanders tried to rally their men, but the sheer noise and pressure of battle made coordination nearly impossible. Bunkers that had held out for months were overrun one by one, their garrisons slaughtered or taken prisoner. Finnish counterattacks, launched with bravery, were torn apart by concentrated firepower. The winter camouflage that had once made the Finns ghosts of the forest now seemed useless on open, devastated ground. Men who had fought since November found themselves without cover, staring down endless Soviet columns. Casualties mounted with terrifying speed, and the once unshakable morale of the defenders wavered. The Finnish command realized that holding the line indefinitely was no longer possible. A strategic withdrawal was the only way to preserve the army. General Mannerheim, watching the catastrophe unfold, faced the hardest decision of the war. He knew that continued resistance on the Isthmus would mean the destruction of Finland's entire fighting force. The order was given to retreat, but to do so in a way that bought precious time. Units were instructed to fight delaying actions, ambushing Soviet spearheads, and then slipping back under cover of darkness. Bridges were blown, roads mined, and trenches abandoned, only after exacting the highest possible cost. Soldiers wept as they left behind bunkers and trenches they had defended for months with their lives. Villages in the path of the Soviet advance were burned to deny shelter to the invaders. Retreating columns trudged through snow, exhausted and frostbitten, but still carrying their rifles. The retreat was not a rout, but a disciplined withdrawal, a testament to the army's resilience. Yet the psychological blow was immense. The Mannerheim line had fallen. As the Finnish lines bent backward, Soviet troops surged forward with newfound confidence. For the first time since the war began, the Red Army sensed that victory was within reach. Tanks rolled unopposed across gaps, infantry seized crossroads, and artillery followed close behind. Soviet propaganda hailed the offensive as proof of Stalin's genius and the Red Army's might. In truth, it had been purchased with staggering losses, but Moscow cared only for the appearance of triumph. Finnish civilians in the path of the advance faced terror and displacement, fleeing with what little they could carry. Refugees clogged roads, moving alongside weary soldiers in an exodus of survival. The once stable front dissolved into a fluid, chaotic landscape of fire and flight. The march of the Red Army was inexorable, pressing the Finns closer to Viipuri. The war's endgame was drawing near. The city of Viipuri, Finland's second largest, became the final bulwark. As Finnish troops withdrew into its approaches, they fortified ruined buildings and prepared street-by-street defences. Artillery was emplaced in cellars, snipers stationed in church towers, and barricades erected from rubble. It was here that the battered army hoped to make a last stand, buying enough time for diplomacy to save the nation. Soviet divisions closed in relentlessly, their numbers swelling to overwhelming proportions. Yet the defenders fought with grim determination, knowing their homeland's fate hung in the balance. Snow fell thick upon the city, muffling the sounds of shells and boots in the ruins. Soldiers lit makeshift fires in abandoned homes, resting briefly before returning to the barricades. Civilians huddled in cellars, praying as the front thundered outside. Viipuri had become the last hope in a war of survival. The breaking of the Mannerheim line had a profound impact beyond the battlefield. In Helsinki, government ministers faced the grim reality that continued resistance was unsustainable. Diplomatic feelers were already being extended to Moscow, searching for a way out before total collapse. Western powers, still debating intervention, now seemed too distant and indecisive to matter. The loss of Finland's strongest defences left the nation exposed and vulnerable to complete conquest. International sympathy remained strong, but sympathy could not halt Soviet artillery or tanks. Every day of fighting brought more dead, more refugees, and more pressure on a weary nation. The sense of isolation deepened and hope shifted from battlefield miracles to negotiations. The war was no longer about victory, but about survival on any terms possible. The breaking of the line was both a military and political turning point. For the men who fought there, the fall of the Mannerheim line left scars that never faded. Veterans would recall the endless shelling, the choking smoke, and the sense of helplessness as their defences crumbled. They spoke of comrades buried alive in bunkers, of last stands fought with bayonets in burning trenches. They remembered the bitter retreat, the frostbite, and the tears shed over abandoned positions. Yet they also remembered the courage, the refusal to surrender even when all seemed lost. The fall of the line was not a failure of will, but the inevitable weight of overwhelming force. Finland's army had done the impossible for months, holding back a colossus with determination and ingenuity. But in February 1940, even that iron resistance met its breaking point. The Red Army had finally cracked the wall, and Finland now faced the abyss. The Winter War was entering its final desperate chapter. In February 1940, Finland stood on the razor's edge between survival and destruction. The collapse of the Mannerheim line had left the nation exposed to Soviet advances that threatened its very heart. In Helsinki, the cabinet met in tense, smoke-filled rooms, weighing choices that no free government wished to make. On one side were those who demanded continued resistance, arguing that national honor could not be surrendered. On the other side were pragmatists, who feared that the nation would be obliterated if peace was not sought soon. Reports from the front poured in, filled with grim details of retreats, mounting casualties, and the desperate condition of the army. Civilians across the country listened anxiously to radio updates, aware that the fate of their homeland hung by a thread. Children huddled in cellars during air raids, their mothers praying as bombs thundered overhead. Factories worked day and night, producing rifles, shells, and uniforms, yet output could not match Soviet might. Finland was a small nation fighting a giant, and exhaustion was beginning to show. The Finnish government faced a fundamental dilemma that went beyond politics and ideology. If they chose to negotiate, they risked losing vast territories that had been Finnish for generations. Yet if they fought on, they faced the real possibility of annihilation, both militarily and nationally. President Kyösti Kallio and his ministers argued fiercely, each side presenting the stakes with brutal clarity. Prime Minister Risto Risti feared that surrender would mean humiliation, but he also feared national extinction. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, commander of the armed forces, pressed for negotiation, knowing his soldiers could not endure much longer. He reminded the cabinet that a nation could survive territorial loss, but it could not survive if its entire army was annihilated. Emotions ran high as ministers shouted across the table, torn between pride and survival. No decision could be made without acknowledging the heavy burden of sacrifice already borne. Every hour of debate meant more Finnish lives lost on the front lines. The government was trapped between the demands of honor and the logic of survival. Meanwhile, civilian suffering reached unbearable levels across the country. In Helsinki and other cities, Soviet bombers dropped explosives indiscriminately, targeting not only military sites but also homes and schools. Families fled to underground shelters, clutching what few possessions they could carry. In rural areas, villages were burned or abandoned as advancing troops drew closer. Refugees clogged the roads, pushing carts laden with blankets, livestock, and memories of a life now lost. Children cried from hunger, mothers struggled to comfort them, and fathers dug defensive ditches before being called to the front. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, where nurses worked in freezing conditions with dwindling supplies. Typhus, pneumonia, and frostbite spread among the weak and the displaced. The sense of national unity remained strong, but its cost was etched into every pale face and weary step. The civilian population endured their own war, one fought with hunger, cold, and despair. Total mobilization was declared, drawing every able-bodied man into the war effort. Boys barely 17 were rushed into uniforms, given rifles, and sent to the front. Older men too frail for combat took up positions guarding roads, manning supply depots, or assisting with fortifications. Women worked tirelessly in factories, weaving uniforms, sewing bandages, and manufacturing ammunition. Housewives transformed into defenders of the home front, keeping families alive while their men fought and died. Students drilled in city squares, preparing for the possibility that even Helsinki itself might become a battlefield. Farmers left fields untended as they hauled supplies to the front lines. Priests delivered sermons that urged courage, even as churches stood half-ruined from bomb blasts. The entire nation became a fortress, with every hand contributing to survival. Yet the mobilization only underscored the desperation. Finland was throwing everything it had into the fire. At the front, soldiers bore the weight of this national gamble with quiet endurance. Many had fought since November without respite, their faces hollow from hunger and sleepless nights. Their uniforms were torn and patched, their boots worn thin by endless marches in snow. Ammunition was rationed, forcing gunners to conserve shells even as Soviet artillery roared without pause. Food supplies were meager, with soldiers eating thin porridge, frozen bread, or whatever game could be hunted. Letters from home spoke of bombings and hunger, deepening their sense of duty, but also their despair. Despite exhaustion, they fought with ferocity, ambushing Soviet patrols and holding ground inch by inch. Yet they could see the writing on the wall as Soviet forces advanced in endless waves. Men asked themselves whether their sacrifice would save the nation or simply delay the inevitable. The front was no longer a place of hope, but a crucible of survival. Diplomatic channels were quietly reopened as the fighting raged. Sweden, though officially neutral, acted as an intermediary, urging Finland to consider terms before it was too late. The Soviets, emboldened by their breakthroughs, presented harsh demands that would strip Finland of vital territories. These included the Karelian Isthmus, Viipuri, and access to strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland. For the Finns, the loss of Viipuri was particularly painful, As it was both a cultural and economic heartland, the government hesitated, knowing that acceptance would mean uprooting tens of thousands of their own people. Yet the alternative was unthinkable: the destruction of the entire Finnish army and occupation of the nation. Diplomats debated language, trying to salvage dignity while conceding ground. Newspapers could not report the details, but whispers spread among the population. The shadow of peace hung over every conversation, as much dreaded as it was hoped for. International observers watched closely as Finland reached this breaking point. In London and Paris, newspapers praised Finnish courage, even as governments remained hesitant to act. Volunteers from across Europe begged to be allowed to fight, but logistics and politics made intervention unlikely. The League of Nations had condemned the Soviet invasion, yet its words carried no real weight. Germany, meanwhile, stayed silent, bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Moscow. For Finland, it was a stark reminder that in the brutal world of 1940, small nations could expect sympathy, but rarely salvation. The global attention that had once inspired hope now seemed hollow. Each passing day made it clearer that Finland would have to stand or fall on its own. International admiration could not shield Finnish soldiers from artillery fire or protect civilians from bombings. The eyes of the world were watching, but its hands remained idle. As February turned to March, the decision became impossible to delay. The cabinet, weary from endless debate, finally leaned toward acceptance of peace. The army's reports grew more desperate, describing thinning ranks and collapsing defenses. Mannerheim himself pressed for an end, knowing that another month of war would break his army beyond repair. Civilians pleaded for relief as bombings intensified and food ran out. Ministers who had once shouted for resistance now fell silent, crushed by the grim logic of survival. The nation had fought with unmatched courage, but courage could not defeat exhaustion and overwhelming numbers. Finland stood on the brink, facing a peace that would wound its pride but preserve its existence. The final choice was no longer about victory, but about whether Finland itself would endure. The Winter War was entering its tragic conclusion. On March 12, 1940, the guns of the Winter War finally fell silent. After 105 days of brutal combat, Finland and the Soviet Union signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, ending a conflict that had captured the world's attention. The terms were harsh and unforgiving, dictated entirely by Stalin's will and enforced by the Red Army's looming presence. Finland was forced to cede 11% of its territory, including Karelia, which meant surrendering the fortified city of Viipuri, its second largest urban center. The ceded land included 30 towns, 422 villages, and crucial stretches of borderland that had been Finland's shield. The territory also encompassed forests, farmland, and industries vital to the economy. In all, nearly 400,000 Finns, 1/10 of the nation's population, were uprooted from their homes overnight. For them, the treaty meant not only loss of land, but loss of history, heritage, and identity. Finland had survived as a nation, but the price was a wound that would never fully heal. The negotiations in Moscow had been marked by tension, exhaustion, and humiliation. Finnish diplomats sat at long tables across from Soviet representatives who held every advantage. The Soviets, flush with fresh victories on the Karelian Isthmus, pressed their demands without compromise. Finland's delegation tried to salvage what it could, but their bargaining power had evaporated with the collapse of the Mannerheim line. Maps were unrolled, borders redrawn, and signatures affixed in a ceremony that felt less like diplomacy and more like surrender. The Finns had no choice but to accept, for the army could not hold another week, and the population was starving. The sense of defeat weighed heavily in every word exchanged, every gesture across the negotiating table. The treaty was signed with dignity, but beneath that dignity was bitterness and despair. What Finland gained in survival, it lost in sovereignty over lands cherished for centuries. The Moscow Peace Treaty was peace in name, but tragedy in reality. The greatest human cost of the treaty was the displacement of the Karelian population. Entire families were given only days to abandon homes that had stood for generations. Farmers left behind fertile fields, craftsmen abandoned workshops, and shopkeepers locked doors that would never be reopened. Churches, schools, and graveyards, anchors of community life, were left to the advancing Soviets. Refugee columns stretched for miles, with horse-drawn carts piled high with possessions that could be saved. Mothers carried infants bundled in rags, while children clung to toys that reminded them of a vanished home. Elderly villagers wept as they looked back at houses built by their fathers and grandfathers. The exodus was not just a movement of people, but an uprooting of culture itself. In the freezing March air, 400,000 Finns became refugees in their own country. Their sorrow echoed the wider national grief of a people forced to sacrifice land for survival. For the Finnish government, the treaty was a bitter pill to administer. Leaders who had urged resistance now stood before Parliament to justify concessions that seemed unbearable. President Kyösti Kallio, his health already fragile, was devastated by the outcome and wept openly when the terms were made public. Prime Minister Risto Ryti defended the decision as the only means to save the nation from total destruction. Marshal Mannerheim, whose soldiers had fought with unmatched valor, accepted the treaty with stoic sadness. He knew that Finland had achieved the unthinkable by surviving against a vastly superior enemy, but he also knew the cost. Ministers debated how to resettle the refugees, rebuild the economy, and prepare for an uncertain future. The loss of Karelia left scars not only on maps, but on the hearts of the entire population. Each leader carried the weight of those 400,000 displaced lives like a personal burden. The peace was necessary, but it brought no relief from grief. Internationally, the treaty was received with shock and resignation. Newspapers around the world hailed Finland's courage, but lamented its losses. In London and Paris, governments faced criticism for their failure to act while Finland bled. Sweden, which had supplied volunteers and material aid, watched helplessly as its neighbor was dismembered. Germany, bound to Moscow by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, expressed no sympathy, leaving Finland further isolated. The League of Nations, which had expelled the Soviet Union during the war, proved powerless to enforce any justice. Sympathy flooded Finland in words, but little in deeds, and the nation was left to face its fate alone. The treaty confirmed that in 1940, realpolitik outweighed morality, and small nations were pawns in a global game. For the Finns, the admiration of the world was meaningless compared to the loss of Karelia. The sense of betrayal lingered long after the ink on the treaty had dried. On the ground, the Red Army wasted no time occupying the ceded territories. Soviet soldiers marched into Karelia, raising red flags over towns where Finnish flags had flown for decades. The new borders placed Leningrad further from danger, achieving Stalin's primary objective. Yet for the Soviets, the victory was far from total, for their losses had been catastrophic, hundreds of thousands dead, wounded, or missing. The sight of burned-out tanks and frozen corpses still haunted the forests and fields of Karelia. The Soviets had won the land, but they had not broken the Finnish spirit. Many Red Army soldiers marveled at the courage of the defenders they had fought. Though Stalin claimed triumph, he privately acknowledged that the campaign had been an embarrassment to Soviet arms. The treaty secured territory, but it revealed the limits of brute force against determined resistance. For ordinary Finns, the day the treaty was announced was one of mourning. Crowds gathered in town squares to hear the terms read aloud. their faces etched with disbelief. Families wept openly, unable to fathom how their homes and villages could simply vanish behind new borders. Soldiers returning from the front marched silently, their pride in survival tempered by sorrow at the outcome. Children asked why they had to leave their houses, and parents struggled to explain a war they had not started. The national mood was heavy, with both relief and grief, a paradox that defined the end of the Winter War. Finland had endured, but at a cost so great it was hard to call it victory. Priests led services of remembrance, reminding the nation of the fallen who had bought its survival with blood. Bells tolled across the land, not in triumph, but in solemn commemoration. The treaty ended the war, but it began an era of mourning. The Moscow Peace Treaty did not close the chapter of conflict. It merely paused it. In villages and cities, whispers circulated that the struggle with the Soviet Union was far from over. The displaced Karelians longed for a return to their homes, vowing never to forget their loss. Mannerheim, though loyal to the peace, quietly prepared defenses in case of future hostilities. Politicians debated whether the sacrifices had been worthwhile or whether more resistance might have secured better terms. Across the nation, anger and grief mingled with pride at having survived. The Winter War had become part of Finland's identity, a story of courage etched into every family's memory. The peace treaty left scars that would shape Finnish politics, diplomacy, and strategy for decades to come. In 1940, Finland remained independent, but its wounds remained raw and open. The Moscow Peace Treaty was not an ending, but a fragile interlude in a larger struggle. The Winter War was short in duration, but its toll in blood and suffering was staggering. For Finland, a nation of barely 4 million people, the losses were devastating and touched nearly every household. Over 25,000 soldiers were killed, and nearly 44,000 more were wounded, many carrying scars that would last a lifetime. Countless men returned from the front missing limbs, blinded or permanently disabled by frostbite and shrapnel. Families who had sent fathers, brothers, and sons into the snowy forests often received only silence in return. Letters stopped coming, and telegrams delivered the cruel news of death with mechanical formality. Villages erected makeshift shrines as names of the fallen were etched into local memory. Civilian casualties added to the grief, as bombings of cities like Helsinki and Viipuri killed hundreds of innocents. Children were buried alongside their parents, victims of indiscriminate Soviet air raids. The war was over, but the grief was only beginning. For the Soviet Union, the cost was even higher, revealing the staggering human price of Stalin's ambitions. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 126,000 and 167,000 Red Army soldiers were killed in 3 months of fighting. Tens of thousands more were wounded, and entire divisions were shattered in the frozen forests of Karelia and Suomussalmi. Soviet commanders concealed the true figures, fearing Stalin's wrath and the shame of failure. Mass graves were hastily dug in snowdrifts, where frozen corpses lay stacked like cordwood. Families across the Soviet Union never received word of their loved ones, their fate lost in the chaos of war. The Red Army soldiers were poorly trained, badly equipped, and ordered into battles that were more slaughter than strategy. Young conscripts from rural villages froze to death in trenches before ever seeing combat. Mothers in Ukraine, Russia, and Central Asia waited in vain for sons who would never come home. The Soviet victory was written in blood as much as it was in territory. Beyond statistics, the war was measured in human suffering etched into the faces of survivors. Refugees from Karelia became a living reminder of the cost of survival. Entire communities uprooted themselves, carrying memories and possessions into the interior of Finland. Old women wept as they left behind family graves, uncertain if they would ever return to honor them. Children asked why they had to abandon their homes, why strangers would now live in their villages. The pain of dislocation was felt in every refugee camp, where families huddled in overcrowded barns and schools converted into shelters. Food was scarce, heating was inadequate, and disease spread quickly among the displaced. Yet through hardship, the refugees displayed resilience, helping each other endure and building new lives out of ruins. Their suffering became a symbol of Finland's sacrifice, a visible wound carried into the nation's future. In their faces, the cost of the Winter War was inescapable. The soldiers themselves carried scars that no treaty could erase. Finnish veterans returned home hardened by battle, yet haunted by the memories of frozen comrades and endless artillery fire. Many struggled with what would now be called post-traumatic stress, waking in the night to visions of Soviet tanks breaking through the snow. Some were hailed as heroes, their deeds celebrated in newspapers and public ceremonies. Others slipped quietly back into villages, their service acknowledged only by the emptiness in their families. Wounded veterans faced years of rehabilitation with limited medical resources. Prosthetic limbs were crudely fashioned, and psychological care was almost non-existent. Husbands and fathers who once provided now depended on their families for survival. The war had changed not only Finland's borders, but also the very fabric of its society. In every town, the human cost was visible in the broken bodies of men who had given everything. Their sacrifice defined a generation, but it also burdened it with grief. On the Soviet side, the war left an invisible legacy of grief and silence. Stalin's regime refused to acknowledge the true scale of losses, leaving families in ignorance. Mothers were told their sons had died heroically, even when the truth was that they froze in the woods without food. Widows received meager pensions and no explanations. Soldiers who returned often bore resentment, not pride at the senselessness of their ordeal. Survivors spoke in whispers about incompetence and brutality in the Red Army's leadership. Frostbite maimed thousands, with men losing hands, feet, or entire limbs to the cold. Villages in the Soviet Union welcomed back shattered men, their return a grim contrast to the propaganda of victory. The silence enforced by the state only deepened the suffering, erasing individual stories into faceless statistics. Yet beneath the silence, private grief continued to fester. For millions of Soviets, the Winter War was a personal tragedy hidden behind a curtain of official triumph. Children bore the deepest scars of the war, their innocence shattered by violence. In Finland, young boys and girls endured nights in freezing shelters as bombs shook the earth above them. Some grew up as orphans, their fathers killed in the trenches and mothers lost to air raids. Refugee children carried memories of fire and displacement, shaping lives forever marked by loss. In the Soviet Union, conscripts barely out of adolescence were thrown into battle, their youth devoured by Stalin's orders. Many never lived to see adulthood, their potential erased in Karelia's frozen forests. Survivors grew old, remembering the faces of comrades who never came home. For both nations, the next generation carried the shadows of the Winter War in silence. Childhoods ended too soon, and innocence was buried beneath snow and ash. The human cost was not just in lives lost, but in futures destroyed. The trauma extended beyond individuals to entire communities. Finnish villages returned to life after the war, but always with empty chairs at family tables. Farms lacked men to till the soil, factories lacked workers, and schools lacked teachers who had fallen in battle. In cities, widows became the backbone of households, raising children alone while working to keep families fed. Churches rang their bells for the dead, but their cemeteries quickly filled with the fallen. In the Soviet Union, rural collectives and urban neighborhoods alike felt the loss of young men who had been the heart of their communities. The absence was felt not only in labor, but in the silence of streets that had once echoed with laughter. Every community bore wounds that time could not easily heal. The war ended, but the losses continued to shape life for decades. The human cost was not a moment, it was a legacy. Ultimately, the Winter War was a conflict measured not in victories or treaties, but in the lives it consumed. For Finland, survival came at the price of 25,000 dead and 400,000 displaced. For the Soviet Union, conquest came at the cost of over 100,000 dead and tens of thousands crippled. Civilians across both nations carried burdens of hunger, trauma, and grief. Soldiers bore scars of body and soul, their lives divided into before and after the war, families rebuilt, but always with the memory of what had been lost. The human cost was written in graves, in broken families, and in the eyes of survivors who carried the war with them. Beyond politics and strategy, the Winter War was a tragedy of people. Its story is not only one of courage and resistance, but of the incalculable price of survival. This was the true legacy of those frozen months in 1939 and 1940. The Winter War, though brief, sent shockwaves across the globe that far outweighed its length. For observers abroad, the conflict revealed stunning truths about both Finland's resilience and the Soviet Union's shortcomings. Military experts studied the war with fascination, noting how a tiny nation of 4 million had withstood the might of Stalin's empire for 3 months. The Red Army, once portrayed as an unstoppable juggernaut, was exposed as clumsy, ill-prepared, and riddled with flaws. Foreign correspondents described Soviet columns annihilated by Finnish ski troops and tanks destroyed by homemade Molotov cocktails. The myth of Soviet invincibility, carefully nurtured by propaganda, was shattered in the frozen forests of Karelia. Western powers began to question the Red Army's ability to wage modern war against a capable opponent. At the same time, Finland's performance inspired admiration, though sympathy did not translate into decisive aid. The world saw courage, but it also saw vulnerability on both sides. The lessons of the Winter War would echo into the coming global conflict. For Stalin, the humiliation was undeniable and deeply personal. His purges of the late 1930s had decapitated the Red Army's leadership, leaving inexperienced commanders to stumble through disaster. Officers were paralyzed by fear of making mistakes, leading to rigid tactics and unimaginative assaults. Soldiers lacked adequate training, proper equipment, and reliable communication systems. Entire divisions were lost not only to Finnish resistance, but to blizzards, frostbite, and starvation. Stalin was furious at reports of failure, but he also recognized the need for reform. The Red Army's performance in Finland convinced him that changes had to be made before facing larger threats. In the months following the treaty, Soviet military doctrine underwent rapid revision, new commanders were promoted, equipment modernized, and emphasis placed on combined arms operations. The blood spilled in Finland became the foundation of reforms that would later prove crucial in the war against Germany. The humiliation was costly, but it forced adaptation. The perception of Soviet weakness did not go unnoticed in Berlin. Adolf Hitler, watching events unfold from afar, concluded that the Red Army was a paper tiger. He believed that if Finland could humble Stalin's forces, then the Wehrmacht could destroy them outright. The lessons of the Winter War fed into Hitler's confidence in launching Operation Barbarossa in 1941. German military planners cited Soviet blunders in Karelia as proof that the Red Army was incapable of coordinated defense. They dismissed the Soviet capacity for recovery, overlooking the reforms and expansions underway after March 1940. The arrogance born from Finland's resistance would prove catastrophic when Germany underestimated its eastern foe. Yet at the time, the Winter War emboldened Nazi ideology and convinced Hitler of Soviet inferiority. In his eyes, Stalin's empire was brittle, vulnerable, and ripe for conquest. The echoes of frozen Karelia thus reverberated into the greatest invasion of the war. The price of misjudgment would be paid in millions of lives. For Western democracies, the Winter War revealed both opportunity and hesitation. Britain and France admired Finland's stand, but failed to intervene decisively, restrained by logistics and politics. Their debates about sending aid through Norway and Sweden exposed divisions within their governments. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York praised Finnish courage, yet policy remained confined to rhetoric. Military leaders studied Finland's tactics, particularly the use of small mobile units against larger mechanized forces. Ski troops, camouflage, and ambush tactics became case studies for armies preparing for wider conflict. The world recognized the importance of terrain, weather, and morale in shaping battle outcomes. At the same time, the inability of the League of Nations to act demonstrated the impotence of international institutions. For Finland, global admiration was cold comfort when no armies marched to its defense. The war underscored the limits of sympathy in a world already on the brink of total war. One of the most striking lessons came from the Finnish use of ingenuity against overwhelming odds. The Molotov cocktail, a simple bottle filled with flammable liquid, became a symbol of resourceful defiance. Ski patrols struck like ghosts, exploiting forests and snowfields where Soviet armor faltered. Small groups of sharpshooters, like the legendary Simo Heihe, showed how individuals could terrorize entire divisions. Finnish defensive lines, though lightly armed, made masterful use of terrain to slow and bleed Soviet advances. The concept of Motti tactics, encircling and isolating enemy units into smaller pockets, demonstrated the effectiveness of unconventional approaches. Military academies abroad studied these methods, recognizing their relevance for guerrilla warfare. The world learned that technology alone did not guarantee victory, and morale could outweigh numbers. Finland proved that determination, improvisation, and terrain mastery could offset brute force. These lessons were adopted by resistance movements across Europe in the years that followed. From Karelia's forests came strategies that shaped global war. The Soviet reforms following humiliation were swift and brutal in their efficiency. Generals like Georgy Zhukov emerged, embodying a new emphasis on operational flexibility and combined arms warfare. Stalin accelerated the development of new tanks, artillery, and aircraft to prevent future embarrassment. Training standards were raised, and harsh discipline was enforced to eliminate the chaos of 1939. Soviet industry was mobilized on a vast scale, ensuring that future campaigns would not lack material strength. The Red Army also learned the value of massed artillery and coordinated assaults, techniques honed after the debacle in Finland. These reforms did not erase the humiliation of the Winter War, but ensured it would not be repeated. By 1941, the Soviet Union had transformed its armed forces into a more formidable machine. The lessons learned in Karelia would be paid forward in blood during the defense of Moscow and Stalingrad. Finland had forced a giant to stumble, but in doing so it had awakened it. The cost of that awakening would be felt across the world. The Winter War also shaped the psychology of small nations caught between great powers. Finland's survival, despite losing territory, became a beacon for resistance across occupied Europe. Countries under Nazi and Soviet domination took inspiration from the idea that even the smallest nations could wound giants. The war showed that independence could be preserved even when concessions were forced. Resistance movements later in Poland, Yugoslavia, and Norway drew strength from Finland's example. At the same time, the war was a cautionary tale of isolation. Finland's appeals for aid had gone largely unanswered, demonstrating the dangers of relying on international sympathy. The lesson for small states was clear. Survival required self-reliance, determination, and preparation. The story of Finland's endurance became part of a broader narrative of defiance during World War II. Though scarred, the nation emerged with its sovereignty intact. Its example would resonate long after the snow of 1940 had melted. Ultimately, the Winter War left the world with a paradoxical legacy. On one hand, it revealed the vulnerability of the Soviet Union, encouraging reckless assumptions by Germany. On the other hand, it forced the Red Army to reform, ultimately becoming stronger for the greater battles ahead. For Finland, the war was both a tragedy of loss and a triumph of survival. For the international community, it was a reminder that courage alone was insufficient without material support. The lessons drawn were as varied as the observers who studied them, shaped by politics as much as by strategy. Yet one truth was clear: the Winter War was no mere sideshow, but a conflict that reshaped perceptions of global power. In the forests of Karelia, armies learned the cost of arrogance and the value of resilience. The human spirit had proven its strength, but so too had the machinery of war adapted. The frozen struggle of 1939-1940 was not forgotten. It remained a warning to the world of the perils of underestimation. The Moscow Peace Treaty ended the Winter War, but it brought Finland little comfort. The loss of Karelia, with its fertile fields, industries, and the great city of Viipuri, left a gaping wound in the nation's identity. 400,000 refugees had to be resettled, straining an economy already battered by war. Entire villages had to be rebuilt in the Finnish interior, and farmland carved out of wilderness to sustain displaced families. The government scrambled to provide housing, employment, and compensation, but resources were scarce. Towns overflowed with families living in temporary shelters, their grief mixing with determination to begin again. The scars of defeat were visible everywhere, in the empty chairs at family tables, and the silent churches left behind in Karelia. Yet the nation remained united, bound by pride in its soldiers' performance and resentment at Soviet demands. The uneasy peace that followed was not one of reconciliation but of watchfulness. Everyone knew the conflict with Moscow was unfinished business. Politically, Finland found itself walking a narrow and dangerous path. The government in Helsinki faced pressure from both right and left, while trying to maintain neutrality in a Europe spiraling deeper into war. President Kyösti Kallio, weakened by the strain of the conflict, resigned and was succeeded by Risto Ryti, a pragmatic leader with a sharp mind for diplomacy. Marshal Mannerheim remained commander-in-chief, serving as the embodiment of national defense and a guardian figure trusted by the people. Conservative and nationalist factions demanded closer ties to Germany, seeing Berlin as a counterbalance to Moscow. Socialists and moderates warned against entangling alliances, fearing a new war would destroy what was left of the nation. Parliament debated fiercely, but beneath the rhetoric, all agreed that Finland must prepare for another clash. The fragile democracy was strained, but it held, supported by unity born of survival. Every decision carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The peace of 1940 was already fragile, brittle as ice in spring. Internationally, Finland was isolated and vulnerable. The League of Nations had expelled the Soviet Union, but offered no protection, and Western democracies were consumed by their own battles with Hitler. Sweden, though sympathetic, remained neutral and unwilling to risk war by confronting the Soviet Union. Germany, once a distant enemy, suddenly became a potential ally in the eyes of Finnish leaders. Berlin's growing hostility to Moscow seemed to offer Finland a lifeline, though one fraught with moral and strategic dangers. Diplomatic missions shuttled between Helsinki, Berlin, and Stockholm, probing for guarantees of support. The Finns did not want to become pawns, yet they understood their survival depended on great power politics. Soviet spies watched every move, reporting Finland's actions to Moscow with suspicion and alarm. The uneasy peace was really a waiting game, with each side preparing for the next inevitable round. Finland stood in the middle of Europe's storm, small but defiant. Its fate hung on decisions made in capitals far beyond its borders. Economically, the challenges of resettling 400,000 refugees were immense. The government launched massive reconstruction projects, clearing forests, draining marshes, and redistributing land to displaced families. Entire new villages were created in the heart of Finland, often with hastily built homes and primitive infrastructure. Farmers struggled to coax crops from unfamiliar soil, while industries scrambled to replace factories lost in Karelia. Food shortages loomed, and rationing became a fact of daily life. Yet the national spirit of resilience carried the people forward, as communities worked together to support those who had lost everything. Women played a central role, managing households, organizing relief, and keeping the economy alive while men rebuilt defenses. Finland's economy remained fragile, dependent on foreign trade and vulnerable to Soviet pressure. The sacrifices demanded by the Winter War did not end with the treaty. Instead, they deepened in the years of uneasy peace. Survival required not only courage but relentless labor. The Finnish military, scarred but experienced, began rebuilding as soon as the ink dried on the treaty. Lessons from the Winter War were studied with precision, shaping new doctrines for defense and survival. Engineers fortified new lines, focusing on the region near Lake Ladoga and central Finland, where Soviet pressure was most likely to fall. Weapons were purchased abroad whenever possible, though supplies were scarce in a Europe already at war. Training was intensified, with ski patrols and small unit tactics, perfected further for the forests and snowfields. The army remained small compared to the Soviet juggernaut, but it gained confidence from the skills forged in 1939. Civil defense drills continued in towns and cities, with civilians taught to respond to air raids and evacuations. The nation became a fortress in spirit, if not in strength. Every man knew he might be called again, and every family kept their emergency packs ready. The peace was seen as only a pause, never a guarantee. Among the population, the memory of loss turned into a determination for revenge and recovery. Songs, poems, and stories honored the fallen, while warning that their sacrifice could not be wasted. In schools, children learned of the courage at Suomussalmi and the defense of the Mannerheim line. In villages, veterans told stories of comrades who had faced overwhelming odds with unshakable bravery. Yet beneath the pride ran a deep bitterness toward Moscow, whose aggression had left scars across every Finnish family. The refugees from Karelia embodied that bitterness most clearly, their homes gone but their memories unyielding. They became a political force, demanding that Finland never abandon hope of return. Anger and grief were woven into the nation's identity, hardening its resolve. The Winter War had been survival, but the continuation war would become for many about redemption. The seeds of the next conflict were planted in the ashes of the last. For the Soviets, Finland remained a problem that refused to go away. Stalin had secured Karelia and pushed his borders further from Leningrad, but he had not broken Finnish independence. Soviet propaganda painted the war as a triumph, yet Moscow understood it had been a costly embarrassment. The Red Army had suffered enormous losses, and the world had seen its failures. Stalin distrusted Finland, fearing it might ally with Germany and threaten his northwestern flank. Soviet border guards watched Finnish defences closely, reporting every movement and fortification. Espionage increased, with agents planted in Finnish society to monitor political developments. The Kremlin's suspicion only deepened Finland's mistrust. Both sides prepared in silence, each aware that the peace was temporary. The Winter War had ended, but the larger struggle had not. By the summer of 1941, Europe was once again aflame, and Finland's uneasy peace reached its breaking point. Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union, and Finland found itself drawn into his orbit. Promises of lost territories regained, coupled with bitter memories of Karelia, proved irresistible to many Finns. Leaders who had once sworn neutrality now quietly aligned with Berlin, believing it offered the only chance for survival. The people, still mourning their dead and uprooted from their homes, saw opportunity in the prospect of revenge. Finland, between wars, had rebuilt, endured, and waited. Its politicians calculated, its generals planned, and its people hoped for restoration. The world had underestimated Finland once before. Now it prepared to step once more into the fire. The Continuation War was not born in 1941. It had been conceived in the winter of 1940. The Winter War ended in March 1940, yet its echoes would reverberate across generations in both Finland and the Soviet Union. In Finland, it became not merely a conflict, but a cornerstone of national identity, celebrated as proof of the country's resilience. The image of a small, determined nation defying a colossal empire resonated deeply in every village and town. Veterans returned to a country that had lost territory but gained a sense of pride that outweighed defeat. Schoolchildren were raised on stories of frozen battlefields, of ski troops outmaneuvering tanks, of Simo Heihe lurking unseen in white camouflage. These tales became folklore, merging history with legend, shaping how Finns saw themselves in the modern world. At the same time, the scars of loss remained raw, displaced Karelians, shattered families, and graves that dotted the countryside. The war was both trauma and triumph, its contradictions woven into Finland's soul. The miracle of survival became a defining theme of national memory. Even in loss, Finland had won something intangible but enduring. For the Soviet Union, the Winter War was an embarrassment carefully buried beneath layers of propaganda. Stalin proclaimed victory, emphasizing territorial gains while concealing the enormous cost in blood and material. Official histories downplayed the catastrophic early failures, painting them as inevitable struggles against a stubborn foe. Soviet officers who had blundered in 1939 were quietly purged or reassigned, their mistakes erased from the public record. In Leningrad and Moscow, the war was spoken of as a triumph of socialist will, though the truth was whispered in private. Red Army veterans remembered frozen marches, chaotic commands, and the humiliation of being outwitted by far smaller forces. The Kremlin learned bitter lessons about leadership, logistics, and morale, but it never admitted these publicly. Instead, the Winter War became a hidden wound within the Soviet narrative, overshadowed by the coming titanic struggle against Hitler. Among ordinary Soviet soldiers, the memory lingered like frostbite, a reminder of needless suffering. In the USSR's official memory, Finland was a footnote, but in soldiers' memories it was a scar. Internationally, the Winter War took on mythic proportions as the world watched a David defy a Goliath. Newspapers from London to New York ran headlines praising Finnish courage, while political cartoons portrayed Stalin as a blundering giant. Volunteers from dozens of nations flocked to Helsinki, some never reaching the front but carrying the spirit of solidarity. The League of Nations condemned the Soviet invasion, a rare symbolic rebuke against Stalin's power. Yet the international support was largely rhetorical, and Finland fought alone. Still, the symbolism mattered. Finland became a beacon of resistance against tyranny in the dark winter of 1939. Western powers, particularly Britain and France, admired Finnish resilience even as they hesitated to act decisively. Neutral Sweden quietly aided with supplies and volunteers, further strengthening Nordic bonds. The legend of a small nation standing alone would long outlast the actual battles. It became part of global memory, a story retold in classrooms, newspapers, and political speeches. Finland's struggle became a parable of courage for the entire world. Within Finland, the myth of the Winter War was not only national, but deeply personal. Families preserved photographs of fathers, brothers, and sons who had fought in the forests of Karelia. Oral histories passed down the stories of hunger, cold, and bravery, keeping alive the sacrifices of a generation. Veterans organizations ensured that the fallen were remembered in ceremonies and monuments across the land. Villages built memorial stones inscribed with the names of their lost, often more names than survivors. The legacy was not one of despair but of shared sacrifice, a collective memory that bound the nation together. Even those who had lost everything in Karelia took solace in the idea that Finland had defended its independence. For many, the war became a lesson that freedom demanded constant vigilance and readiness. Patriotism was strengthened, not weakened, by defeat, becoming a unifying force in the turbulent years that followed. The Winter War lived on in song, literature, and art, cementing its place in Finnish identity. Memory became both shield and sword, protecting the nation's spirit. The David versus Goliath imagery became central to Finland's legacy, reinforcing its status as a resilient but vulnerable state. Military analysts across the world studied the conflict, drawing lessons about terrain, morale, and improvisation. Finland had demonstrated that courage and ingenuity could slow, though not stop, a numerically superior foe. The effectiveness of ski troops, Molotov cocktails, and small unit ambushes became textbook examples for irregular warfare. Western observers saw in Finland a warning of what the Soviet Union might face against more powerful adversaries. At the same time, the war reminded small nations everywhere that survival often depended on unity and sacrifice. For Finland, this metaphor of David and Goliath was more than biblical. It was political, cultural, and deeply emotional. It taught generations that their nation's very existence could never be taken for granted. Even decades later, Finnish leaders invoked the Winter War as a touchstone of resilience. The legacy shaped not just memory, but policy, influencing foreign relations and defense strategies for generations. The psychological impact of the Winter War was immense, leaving a lasting imprint on both societies. For Finns, the war was proof of their nationhood, binding them in a shared identity forged in fire and frost. The memory of Karelia's loss remained a national wound, shaping politics and fueling dreams of return during the continuation war. The trauma of displacement lingered in every family that had lost their ancestral homes. Yet the survival of independence was a victory that outweighed even these losses. For Soviets, the war exposed vulnerabilities that Stalin moved quickly to correct. Military reforms were accelerated, command structures reshaped, and discipline tightened in preparation for future wars. In this way, the Winter War influenced the Red Army's performance in 1941 against Hitler, indirectly shaping the course of World War II. For Finland, memory was about identity. For the Soviet Union, it was about lessons learned in blood. Both nations carried the Winter War within their future battles. Neither could escape its legacy. In post-war decades, the Winter War's memory was carefully cultivated in Finland's national consciousness. Museums, archives, and war memorials became focal points for education and remembrance. Writers and filmmakers depicted the war with reverence, ensuring that the younger generation would understand the sacrifices made. The figure of Simo Häyhä, the White Death, grew into a legend symbolizing Finnish tenacity. Political leaders referenced the Winter War when rallying the people during later crises, invoking the spirit of 1939. In everyday life, the war lived on through sayings, songs, and family stories told around the hearth. It was less a distant history than a living tradition, woven into the nation's cultural fabric. For Finns to remember the Winter War was to affirm their survival against impossible odds. This cultural memory ensured that the legacy endured long after the veterans had passed away. The Winter War was not simply remembered, it was carried like a torch. Today, the Winter War remains a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the complex interplay between weakness and strength. In Finland, it is seen as a defining chapter of nationhood, shaping how the people view themselves in relation to the wider world. In Russia, it remains a quieter, more complicated memory, acknowledged but rarely celebrated. Globally, it is remembered as one of history's clearest examples of a small nation standing against overwhelming power. Military historians continue to study its lessons, while ordinary people recall its stories of courage and survival. Monuments in Finland bear silent witness, their stone etchings preserving the names of the fallen. Survivor testimonies, recorded in books and archives, ensure that the voices of the Winter War are not silenced. The conflict's memory bridges past and present, reminding the world of the cost of freedom. In every snowy forest, where battles once raged, silence carries the weight of history. The Winter War endures, not as defeat, but as an immortal testament to resilience.